A 2-meter-tall figure of gray light slays monsters at the edge of the forest, with a sword longer than a man. This is his power, the very power that should dwell within his chest. It left him 4 years ago because its master proved too lazy. And according to local laws, that means only one thing: the bonfire. Daniel opens his eyes and sees the rotten ceiling planks. His head feels like it's splitting open, as if a nail had been driven between his eyes. The straw pricks his back. He sits up, and the world sways. His stomach churns. He leans over the edge of the hayloft and vomits right onto someone's boots below. Someone groans and jumps back. Daniel wipes his mouth and looks at his hand. It's not his own. Thinner, younger, with calluses not from a keyboard but from something else. He clenches his fist and unclenches it. His body obeys but with a delay, like a server with high ping. 2 memories coexist in his head. One remembers the nighttime deployment, the energy drink on the dashboard, the glare of oncoming headlights, and the impact. The other remembers the village, his sister, and 4 years of laziness that make him want to howl. Both are real. Both say he's Dan. At least he's lucky with his name. He descends the rickety staircase and his legs give way. 10 steps to the door, and he's gasping for breath as if he'd just run a marathon. He presses his hands against his knees. Then he places a palm on his chest. Where every resident of Haerion has a skill, there should be a warm core, a little sun beneath the ribs, the presence of someone who's always there. Daniel feels nothing, empty, cold, like an empty slot in the system. He looks up at the sky and sees 2 suns. One is white, the other is yellower and smaller. Shadows fall in 2 directions. He stares at it for about 10 seconds and nods to himself. All right, accepted. A girl appears in the doorway across from him, thin, pale, her hair in a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes. His body's memory suggests a name: So-He-in, his younger sister, the one who kept the farm and took care of their 2 brothers for 4 years while their older brother was lazing around in the hayloft. She looks at him as if she's been burned so many times that she no longer believes in warmth, yet still reaches out toward the fire. And then she says something that makes his blood run cold. His skill was seen in the forest. Her voice trembles. He had gone to the northern edge of the forest and seen him. A 2-meter-tall figure made of gray light, wielding a sword longer than a man. It killed the nameless ones one after another, and moved so fast that the eye couldn't keep up. Daniel processes this in his mind. The skill of this body has fled. It's gone, because its former host was so lazy that its own power decided it was better off in the forest than with him. His memory throws up details. The skill takes root at 13. With the former Dan, it was called the Nameless Apprentice. Weak, a gray shadow the size of a child. For 4 years, his master didn't train him, didn't send him on missions, didn't speak to him. The skill was fading away inside him, and then it left. In Haerion, they call this Excommunication, and it's a death sentence. Not because you can't live without the skill, but because the Guild of Bearers considers excommunication a curse, a plague. The 7 excommunicated ones before Dan were found and burned, all 7 of them. Hae-in knows this. That's why her voice trembles. That's why there are tear streaks on her cheeks. Her brother is now a walking pyre for the Inquisition, a programmer from Seoul, 24 years old, a specialist in distributed systems. He died behind the wheel. He woke up in a world where everyone has a built-in partner, but his slot is empty, with a death-inducing debuff, and with a sister who looks at him as if he were the last thing she has left, because he is the last thing. Daniel takes a deep breath and asks if she's eaten today. She blinks. The question catches her off guard, as if he'd asked something impossible. She says she hasn't eaten. Daniel goes into the house. He finds bread, cheese, and water. He cuts them up. He sets 2 plates on the table. He sits down. He waits. Ha-un looks at him as if he were a ghost. The old Dan never set the table. The old Dan would take his food and go up to the hayloft. She sits down across from him. She eats in silence. Her hands are shaking, and Daniel chews and counts. Task number 1, survive. His body is atrophied. His stamina is 0. He's out of breath after 10 steps. Task number 2, the skill. He's in the woods. He's grown strong, but he's not returning to his master, like an employee who quit and went freelance. Formally, the connection remains. Trust is at 0. Task number 3, the Inquisition. If the guild finds out that the skill has run away, they'll burn him. So no one must know. But skill, standing 2 meters tall, glows and slashes creatures right in front of the village elder. So they already know, or they'll find out soon. He finishes his meal and asks if there's anyone in the village she trusts. She thinks for a moment and names Old Moon, the herbalist from the hill. She treated their mother and doesn't like the guild. He asks how far the forest is. Hae-in turns pale. She realizes what he's planning. She says the forest is far away, half a day's walk. The nameless ones are there, and he doesn't even know how to hold a sword. Daniel doesn't. She's right, not in this body. He steps out into the courtyard. The village of So-ra lies in a valley between the hills. A dozen or so houses, fields, a blacksmith shop on the outskirts, a quiet place where everyone knows that the eldest son of the So family is a good-for-nothing whose skill fled out of shame. Behind the barn, he finds a clearing trampled down to the rock, a straw dummy, 3 wooden swords covered in dust and cobwebs, the training ground of the former Dan. It hasn't been touched in 2 years. He picks up the lightest sword. His hand is used to a mouse, not a weapon. He strikes the dummy. The blow comes out weak and off target. His shoulder aches. A second. A third. By the 10th, he's gasping for breath. By the 20th, his hands are shaking. On the 30th, he sits down on the ground and just breathes. 30 strikes. That's all this body is capable of. Daniel takes out a piece of charcoal and some birch bark. He writes it down. 30 strikes, 10 steps of running, 60 kilograms at a height of 175. These are the starting metrics. That's the baseline. He knows this from his work. You can't improve what you haven't measured. Hae-in looks out the window. Her brother, who hasn't touched a sword in 4 years, has gone outside and is striking a dummy. Then he sits down and writes something. The old Dan didn't really know how to write at all. Something has changed. She doesn't understand what, but something has changed. In the afternoon, he goes to the well and runs into a neighbor, a fat man with a red face, Juan, a farmer with a bad temper. He spits and says that Dan, who's been sleeping, has finally woken up. He asks if he's going to go back to bed for another year, and he adds that the So family's debt has grown to 12 silver coins. Daniel looks at him calmly. He asks who they owe it to. Juan replies that it's to Kang-sik, a merchant from the neighboring town, the one who collects collectors. Daniel nods and walks on. Juan shouts something insulting after him. Daniel doesn't turn around. At dinner, Hae-in explains, 12 silver coins is the value of 2 cows, or their harvest for a year and a half. The collectors came twice. The first time, they made threats. The second time, they shoved Hae-in and smashed the pots in the kitchen. Daniel writes it down, not because he needs to write it down, but because writing it down helps him think. You see a problem, you write it down. You break it down into parts, you solve them one by one. In the evening, he lies in the hayloft. Downstairs, Hae-in is tucking in her younger brother, Seo Min-ho, 10 years old, a quiet boy with big eyes. His skill hasn't sprouted yet, 3 years until it sprouts. Hae-in sings a lullaby in a weary voice while mending someone's shirt. Her hands move on autopilot, 16 years old. She keeps the farm running. She cooks. She treats the neighbors for a few coins. She takes the place of her mother, father, and older brother. And her skill is called Silent Stitch. It patches wounds but doesn't heal them. Even her strength lies in holding everything together without getting anything in return. The memory of the former Dan reminds her. Hae-in would go up to the hayloft first thing every morning. She'd check to see if her brother was breathing, because after excommunication, people fade away. For 4 months, every morning she'd climb the ladder and check if he was alive, and every morning She'd find him alive, but motionless, asleep. Worse than dead, because at least the dead won't disappoint. Daniel closes his eyes. He isn't the brother she remembers. He's a stranger in a familiar body, but that doesn't matter. That brother didn't deserve her anyway, and this one, at least, might try. Daniel woke up before dawn. His body ached from yesterday's 30 blows as if he'd unloaded a truck. He slid off the hay and heard footsteps downstairs. Ha-in was coming up the stairs. She froze halfway up when she saw that he was already standing there. Something flashed in her eyes that made Daniel feel uneasy. She was used to finding him asleep every morning for 4 months in a row, but today he had gotten up before her. She didn't say anything. She just turned around and went to the kitchen. Daniel went out into the yard. The morning air was cold and damp. The 2 suns hadn't risen yet, but the sky was already brightening. He started by running. He ran from the shed to the fence and back, about 40 meters. He was gasping for breath after the first lap. He did 3 laps and sat down on the ground. He wrote it down on birch bark. 3 laps. About 120 meters. His heart rate was off the charts. Then he picked up the wooden sword. Yesterday he'd done 30 strikes. Today he decided to do 35. On the 32nd strike, his arm went numb. He switched the sword to his left hand and did 3 more. 35. He wrote it down. Then push-ups. 7. On the 8th, his arms gave out and he fell face first into the dust. He wrote it down. 7. Hae-in called him to breakfast. Porridge made from some kind of grain, thick and tasteless. Daniel ate it all and asked for seconds. Hae-in was surprised. The old Dan used to eat very little and only with great effort. Daniel explained that he needed to eat more. He was rebuilding his body. She looked at him for a long time. Then, without a word, she served him a second helping. After breakfast, Daniel asked Hae-in to tell him everything she knew about the skills. He remembered some things from his previous body's memory, but only in fragments, like files with corrupted encoding. There were bits of information, but the connections between them were missing. Hae-in sat down on a bench by the house and began to tell him. A skill awakens at the age of 13. The ceremony takes place in the village temple. The elder places a hand on the teenager's chest, and the skill manifests. Usually, it's a small, glowing silhouette that says its name and then falls silent. Then the years of training begin. The bearer and the skill grow together. The more you train, the stronger they both become. At age 15, one can join the Bearer's Guild. There, the skill's rank determines everything. Rank S consists of generals and dukes. Rank A consists of knights and commanders. Rank B consists of soldiers and hunters. Rank C is for artisans and farmers. Rank D is for servants. Without a rank, you're nothing. The skill of the former Dan was assigned rank D upon its emergence. The Nameless Apprentice. A gray shadow the size of a child, without a distinct form, without any notable combat abilities. The village decided that the So family's eldest son was a failure. The former Dan decided the same. And he stopped training. He stopped talking to the skill. He stopped leaving the hayloft. 4 years. For 4 years, the skill sat inside a host who didn't even notice it. And then he left. Daniel listened and nodded. The story was familiar. Not from fantasy, from work. He'd seen it dozens of times. A capable junior ends up with a manager who doesn't assign tasks, doesn't praise him, doesn't notice him. The junior sticks it out for half a year and quits. And a year later, it turns out he's joined another company and became a lead developer. The problem was never with the junior. The problem was the manager. The Nameless Apprentice wasn't a weak skill. He was a skill in the hands of a weak master. And when the master stopped even pretending to try, the skill made the only logical decision. He quit. He went freelance. And in 1 week of freedom, he leveled up more than he had in 4 years under someone else's wing. Daniel asked Hae-in if it was possible to bring back the skill that had left. She fell silent for a long time. Then she said she didn't know, that no one knew, because everyone whose skill had left had been burned before they even had a chance to try. Daniel stood up and walked to the training ground. He did 20 more strikes, not because it made any tactical sense, but because he needed to think, and he always thought better when his body was occupied. The skill in the forest, strong, independent, kills the Nameless, and doesn't come back. Option 1. Go into the forest and try to talk to him. Problem: his body won't survive the journey, and if the skill doesn't want to talk, Daniel won't be able to do anything. Option 2. Wait for skill to return on his own. Problem: he might never come back, and the Inquisition might arrive first. Option 3. Make skill want to come back. Daniel settled on the third option. At work, he knew one thing for sure. You can't force a good specialist to stay. You can only create conditions under which leaving would be foolish. He spent the rest of the day tidying up the training area. He pulled out the dummy. He cleaned the wooden swords. He swept the area. Then he tackled the yard. He repaired the fence that had started to lean back when the previous Dan was still around. He chopped some firewood. He fetched water from the well. By evening, his body was exhausted. Every muscle was on fire. But the yard looked different, cleaner, more alive, as if someone were actually living here again, rather than just eking out an existence. Hae-in had been watching him all day from the window and from the garden beds. He could see her. She was trying to figure out what was happening to him. Why her brother, who had been lying in the hayloft for 4 years, had suddenly gotten up and started fixing the fence. That evening at dinner, she asked, directly, without beating around the bush. She asked who he was. Daniel froze with his spoon halfway to his mouth. The question was dangerous. Not because Hae-in might betray him, but because she deserved the truth, and the truth was impossible. He couldn't tell her that he was a programmer from another world who had died in a car accident and woken up in her brother's body. He lowered his spoon. He looked into her eyes. He said he was Dan, the same Dan, but something in him had changed when the skill was gone. That he'd woken up and, for the first time in 4 years, seen everything clearly. He saw that his sister was running the farm all by herself. He saw that the debts were piling up. He saw that he'd wasted 4 years and wasn't about to waste another day. Hae-in listened. Her eyes glistened. She didn't cry. She'd forgotten how to cry sometime around her 2nd year, but her hands clenched the edge of her apron so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She said she wanted to believe him, but that he'd promised to change so many times that his words were worthless now. Daniel nodded. She was right. Words were worthless. Only actions mattered. He washed the dishes after dinner. For the first time in the entire life of this body, Hae-in stood in the doorway and watched him wash the plates. She stood there for a minute. Then she left. That night, Daniel lay on the hayloft and drew up a plan. Birch bark and a piece of charcoal, instead of a laptop and a text editor. But the principle was the same. The project, the restoration of Dan So. Sprint 1, 1 week. Goals: body, increase the number of strikes to 100, run 5 laps, do 20 push-ups. Diet: 3 meals a day, increase portion sizes, find a source of protein. Reconnaissance: determine the exact location of the skill, find out the village head's patrol schedule, find out when guild members were last seen in the village. Relationships: do one thing for Hae-in every day that the old Dan never did. Daniel reread the list. He was used to 2-week sprints at work, but here everything was different. Here, it wasn't a bonus that depended on the result. Here, lives depended on the outcome. He blew out the candle and closed his eyes. Just before falling asleep, he sensed something. Not warmth, not a presence, more like a faint vibration at the very edge of his perception. As if somewhere far away in the forest, someone had turned their head in his direction, for a second, and then turned away again. Daniel opened his eyes. Empty. Silence. Crickets behind the wall. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe not. He closed his eyes again. For 3 days, he lived by a schedule. Up before dawn, running, sword training, push-ups, breakfast, yard work, work, reconnaissance, dinner, logs, sleep. His metrics were growing slowly, but they were growing. 35 swings became 40, 3 laps became 4, 7 push-ups became 10. His body resisted. His muscles ached so badly that he woke up at night with cramps, but he didn't stop. He knew from his past life that the first 2 weeks were the hardest. The body doesn't yet understand that the rules have changed. On the second day, he fixed the kitchen shutter. Hae-in saw him and froze in the doorway. On the third day, he asked her for a list of the herbs she gathers. She was surprised, but gave it to him. He copied it into his notebook and asked which ones brought in the most money. She said it was night mint. It grows on a hill beyond the village, but it must be gathered at night and alone, because in sunlight it loses its properties. She used to go there alone, a 16-year-old girl, at night, through the hills where the small, nameless ones roam, because there was no one else to do it. Daniel wrote this down and said nothing, but a new item appeared. On the fourth day, he went to see the village headman, Park Chol-soo, a heavy-set man with gray sideburns and shrewd eyes, a C-rank holder, skill, stone wall, defensive. The village head met Daniel on the porch and looked at him the way one looks at a stray dog, with contempt and a touch of pity. Daniel asked directly. He asked what the village head had seen in the forest. Park fell silent. Then he said he'd seen a skill, a big one, a strong one. It was killing the nameless ones at the northern edge of the forest. He asked if it was Dan's. Daniel didn't lie. He said it was his. Park's face darkened. He said that if the guild found out, they wouldn't just burn Dan. They'd burn the whole village for harboring him. He asked if Dan understood that. Daniel understood. He asked how much time he had. Park thought for a moment. He said that the Inquisition visits the region once every 3 months. The last time was 2 months ago. That meant Dan had at most a month until the next visit. A month to either reclaim the skill and pretend to be a normal host, or to disappear. Daniel thanked him and left. A month, 30 days. During that time, he needed to make a deal with the creature that had endured the worst master in the history of Haerion for 4 years and had finally escaped. A creature that's now stronger than any host in the village, one that isn't obligated to return, and one that's most likely angry. Daniel walked back along the village road, lost in thought. In his past life, he'd had a developer on his team, a smart guy, talented, but his previous team lead yelled at him for every bug and never once praised him for good code. The guy left. Daniel spent a month and a half trying to lure him back, not with money, not with promises. He simply showed him that the team was different, that the tasks were interesting, that the code was reviewed, not berated. The guy came back. 6 months later, he became the best in the department. The skill was that same guy, only instead of code, he had a sword. And instead of reviews, he needed something else. Something that the old Dan had never given him: respect. On the 5th day, Daniel decided to head toward the forest. Not into the forest itself. He wasn't ready for that yet. His body had regained just enough strength so he wouldn't be gasping for breath while walking. But it was a half-day's walk to the northern edge of the forest, and he needed to at least catch a glimpse of it. Hae-in said she wouldn't let him go. Daniel looked at her and said he wasn't asking for permission. He was informing her. She pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. He added that he'd be back before dark, and that if he didn't return, she should take Min-ho and go to Old Moon's place on the hill. Hae-in didn't say anything. But as he was walking out the gate, she slipped him a bundle of food and a small vial. She said that if he encountered the little nameless one, he should smash the vial on the ground. The pungent mixture would scare the creature away for 10 minutes. It wouldn't last any longer than that. Daniel took them and thanked her. She turned away. He saw her cling to the doorframe. For 4 years, she'd only seen this brother off to the hayloft. And now he was heading for the forest, where anything could go wrong. The journey to the northern edge of the forest took 4 hours. His body began to protest after the 2nd hour. His legs were buzzing. His back ached. Daniel stopped every half hour. He drank water. He ate bread. He recorded the time and distance. He walked along a path through the fields and then over the hills, and gradually the trees grew taller and the light grew dimmer. The forest of the northern mark began with a wall of old oaks with black bark. The locals called them the Silent Ones. They said the trees had absorbed so much of the Nameless One's energy that they had become almost alive. Daniel stopped at the edge of the forest. He had no intention of going any further. He sat down on a fallen tree and waited. He didn't know exactly what he was waiting for, but he felt that this was the right thing to do. Not to barge into the forest like an owner looking for a runaway dog, but to come to the edge and sit down, to show that he had come, that he wasn't hiding, that he was waiting. Like a manager who doesn't call in an employee who's quit for a talk, but instead goes to the coffee shop next to his new office and sits down, just showing that he's ready to talk if the other person wants to. For the first hour, nothing happened. The forest rustled. Somewhere deep inside, branches crackled. A couple of times, Daniel saw movement among the trees. Small shadows, nameless, low-ranking creatures, about the size of a dog, without eyes, with long limbs. They sensed him but didn't attack. Maybe they were afraid of something, or someone. An hour later, Daniel took out a birch bark sheet and began to write. Not a plan, not metrics. He was writing a report. For the skill, like a team lead writing a weekly update that no one had asked for. He wrote that he had woken up 5 days ago, that his body was in poor condition, but he was working on it, that Hae-in was tired and needed help, that he owed 12 silver coins and the collectors would come again, that the Inquisition would be here in a month, that he didn't know what to do and wasn't pretending to know. He placed the birch bark on a stump next to him. He weighed it down with a rock so the wind wouldn't blow it away. He stood up and walked back. He didn't look back, but halfway to the village he felt it again. A slight vibration at the edge of his consciousness, as if someone had read the message and not replied. Read, no reaction, but read. Daniel smiled. The first commit had been sent. He arrived home at sunset. Hae-in was standing by the gate. She had been waiting for him all this time, 4 hours, on her feet, by the gate. When he entered the yard, she turned and went into the house. A minute later, she came out with a bowl of hot porridge. She silently set it on the table. She left without a word. Daniel sat down and ate. The porridge was hot and thick, with some herbs that gave it flavor. Hae-in was a good cook. He hadn't noticed it before because the old Dan didn't notice anything. Early in the morning on the 7th day, Daniel went out for training and froze. On the training ground, at the foot of the dummy, lay a carcass, nameless, medium-sized, about the size of a calf, dead. Its chest slid open with a single blow, a clean cut, perfectly even, the work of a master. Daniel stood and stared at the carcass. Then he looked toward the forest, far away, kilometers away. But he knew who had done it. The skill had come at night, killed the creature, left it on the clearing, and left. Like a cat that brings a mouse and drops it on the doorstep. Not because the owner asked, but because it wants to show that it exists, that it's nearby, that it's capable. Daniel crouched down next to the carcass. He examined the wound. A single blow, from top to bottom. Colossal strength. A nameless mid-rank soldier could kill 5 ordinary soldiers, and his skill cut him down in a single motion. This guy in the woods had grown into something serious. Daniel stood up and went into the house. He took some birch bark and a piece of charcoal. He wrote a note, a short one. He wrote what he'd seen, that he was impressed. A single strike against a mid-tier nameless one indicates at least an A level. He wrote that the carcass would come in handy. Materials worth money can be extracted from the nameless ones. This would help with the debt. He wrote, "Thank you." He went out to the clearing and placed the note on a stump next to the carcass. He weighed it down with a rock. Then he took an old knife from the shed and began to butcher the carcass. The memories of the former Dan were of no help here. The former Dan didn't know how to do anything. But Daniel had experienced butchering meat in his past life, not professionally. He'd just worked part-time at a small restaurant once and learned the basics. He extracted a core from the nameless one. A small, black stone, the size of a walnut, warm, pulsating. His memory told him that the cores of the nameless ones were bought in town. For 1 medium core, they give 2 to 3 silver coins. Daniel placed the core on the table and looked at it. 12 silver coins in debt. 1 core is worth 2 or 3 silver coins. 4 or 5 carcasses like that, and the debt is paid off. In came out of the house and saw him with a knife and a carcass. She turned pale. She asked where he'd gotten it. Daniel told the truth. The skill had brought it, at night. Hae-in sat down on a bench. She couldn't speak. The skill had returned. Not completely, not to Dan's chest, but it had come. It had brought the spoils. For the first time in 4 months, it had done something for its master. She looked up at Daniel. There was something new in her eyes. Not hope, not trust. Something in between. Like a tiny sprout that hadn't yet decided whether it would grow or wither. Daniel continued butchering. By lunchtime, he was done. The core and 3 pieces of usable material. The hide, the claws, and something resembling tendons but as hard as wire. A blacksmith could use it. He laid everything out on a burlap sack and asked Hae-in when the next market day in town was. She said in 3 days. Daniel nodded. In 3 days, he'd go to town, sell the materials, start paying off his debt. And while he was at it, find out what people in the forest were saying about the skill. That evening, he went back to the edge of the forest. It took 4 hours to get there. The birch bark he'd left last time was gone. The stone was still lying in its place. The birch bark was gone. Daniel sat down on a fallen tree. He took out a new piece of birch bark. He wrote another report. His training metrics for the week: 45 sword strikes, 5 laps of running, 12 push-ups. Slow but steady progress. Then he wrote a plan for the coming week. Increase the sword strikes to 60. Run 7 laps. Start practicing with the training sword in his non-dominant hand. And he added a note at the bottom. He wrote that he would sell the Nameless One's core in town, that he would use the money to buy decent food, and new boots for Hae-in because her current ones were leaking. He placed the birch bark on the stump, weighed it down with a stone, stood up, walked back. This time he felt a stronger vibration, not on the edge of his perception, closer, as if someone were standing behind the trees, about 50 meters away, watching his back. Not hostile, not friendly, with curiosity, like a cat watching a stranger from under the couch. Not quite trusting yet, but no longer hiding. Daniel didn't turn around. He didn't quicken his pace. He just walked home. He arrived after dark. Hae-in was waiting at the gate again, silent again, with hot porridge again. This time she sat down at the table across from him and ate with him, in silence, but together. In the morning, 2 bodies lay on the training ground, 2 mid-level Nameless Ones, both killed with a single blow. On the 10th day, Daniel went into town. The town was called Kaen-ni, a 2-hour walk to the east. More than a village, but less than a real town. A market square, a blacksmith shop, an alchemist's shop, a tavern, a debt collector's office, the Bearers Guild office, small, a single room with a coat of arms on the door. Daniel was carrying a sack with 3 cores and materials from the 3 Nameless Ones. It was heavy. His body was already stronger than it had been 10 days ago, but 2 hours of carrying the load were still a struggle. He was sweating and gasping for breath when he entered the market square. Market day, noisy, people, carts, the smell of roasted meat, leather, and manure. Daniel stopped and looked around. His body's memory didn't know this place well. The old Dan had been here a couple of times, and both times he'd hidden behind his mother's back. Daniel found the alchemist's stall, an old man with long fingers and keen eyes, a C-rank practitioner, skill, keen nose. He could determine the quality of ingredients with a single breath. The old man examined the cores, sniffed them, rolled them between his fingers. He named his price, 2 silver coins for each, 6 for 3. Daniel didn't haggle. He knew he wasn't good at haggling in this world, and any attempt would reveal his inexperience. 6 silver coins, half of his debt for the week. He sold the hides and claws to the blacksmith, another 2 silver coins. Another merchant took the tendons, 1 silver coin. That makes 9 silver coins total. The debt is 12, 3 left to pay. 1 nighttime foray by Nava, and the debt is paid off. Daniel bought grains, dried meat, salt, new boots for Hae-in. He spent a long time choosing the size. His body's memory didn't know his sister's shoe size. The old Dan hadn't paid attention to such things. Daniel estimated based on his memory. Hae-in was short. She had small feet. He picked the smallest adult size. Then he went to Kangshik's office, the debt collector. The office stood on the corner of the square, a sturdy door. 2 guards. Inside, a man sat at a desk, not Kang-shik himself, his assistant, a skinny guy with shifty eyes. Daniel placed 9 silver coins on the table. He said it was a debt owed by the So family from the village of Seoul. The skinny guy counted them. He wrote it down in a ledger. He said the balance was 3 silver coins and that if it wasn't paid by the end of the month, interest would accrue. Daniel asked what the interest rate was. The skinny guy said 2 silver coins. That would make 5 in total if he dragged it out. Daniel nodded and left. He stopped on the street. 5 silver coins by the end of the month. 2 nameless ones. That was possible if Skill kept bringing in carcasses, but he couldn't count on it. Skill wasn't his employee. Skill did whatever he wanted. He brought in carcasses of his own free will. He could stop at any moment. Daniel walked through the market, thinking. He needed a plan B, a way to make money without Skill. He went into a tavern to drink some water and eavesdrop on the conversations. The tavern was dirty and noisy. Laborers, merchants, a few messengers bearing the crests of small mercenary units. Daniel sat in a corner and listened. 2 mercenaries at the next table were discussing a job. The Nameless had proliferated along the southern highway. A merchant caravan was hiring guards. The pay was 5 silver pieces per week per person. A minimum of rank B was required. Another conversation. A farmer from the Western Valley was complaining that his skill had started acting strangely. It wouldn't obey him. It was slowing down. It used to plow a field in an hour, but now it takes 3. Someone suggested he go see the guild healer. Another said the healer charges 1 silver for a consultation, and it's a total waste of time. Daniel listened. Skills that don't obey. Interesting. He finished his water. He stood up and bumped into someone at the door. A woman, tall, black hair pulled back into a tight knot, a scar across her left eyebrow, leather armor worn white at the creases, 2 short swords at her belt. Her eyes were gray and cold. She looked down at Daniel. He was a head shorter than her. She told him to watch where he was going. Her voice was low and hoarse. Daniel apologized and stepped aside. She walked over to the bar and ordered something strong. His body's memory didn't recognize her, but judging by her gear and demeanor, she was a mercenary, a serious one. Not the kind who take caravan jobs. The kind who take jobs where caravan mercenaries die. Daniel left the tavern. On his way back across the square, he noticed a notice on the bulletin board at City Hall. The Bearers Guild was announcing recruitment for the fall certification. In 2 months, any bearer 15 years of age or older could apply. The certification determined one's rank and opened the doors to the guild. The old Dan had never applied. His skill was ranked D at the time of its emergence, and everyone assumed that was as high as it would go. Daniel stood in front of the notice and thought, 2 months. If by then his skill returned, and they could work together. If he could demonstrate something at the certification that no one had ever seen before. Not brute force, not technique, but partnership. If he could pass the certification as a host with a skill that acted of its own volition rather than on command. It was a chance, not a guarantee, but a chance. He memorized the date and headed home. The walk back took longer. His legs were tired. The shopping bag weighed heavily on his shoulders. He arrived in the village at sunset. Hae-in was waiting at the gate, as always. Daniel silently set the bag down in front of her. She opened it and saw grains, meat, and salt. Then she saw the boots. She took them out and held them in her hands. New, sturdy, dark leather. Just the right size. She looked up at Daniel. He said he'd paid 9 silver coins toward the debt. 3 remained. And that he'd bought her the boots because her old ones were leaking and she'd catch a cold in the fall. Hae-in pressed the boots to her chest. She didn't cry. She'd long since forgotten how. But her lips were trembling, and she quickly turned away and went into the house. Daniel stood in the yard. Min-ho's younger brother peeked out from around the corner. A quiet boy with big eyes. He looked at Daniel, not as a brother, but as a stranger. The Daniel of old hadn't paid him any attention. Min-ho was used to being invisible. Daniel crouched down in front of him. He asked if he wanted to help chop wood. Min-ho blinked. Then he nodded. They chopped wood together until dark. Min-ho was weak but diligent. Daniel showed him how to hold the axe properly. He didn't give orders. He showed him, just as an older brother should. That evening, Daniel walked toward the edge of the forest. Not all the way there, just halfway. He knew that Navik was somewhere nearby. He He could feel the vibration more clearly with each passing day. He sat down on a rock. He took out a piece of birch bark. He wrote. He sold the materials for 9 silver coins. His debt was almost paid off. He bought food and boots for Hae-in. In 2 months, there would be the guild certification. He wrote that he intended to apply, but not to become a guild member and submit to their rules. Rather, to obtain a status that would protect him and his family from the Inquisition. He wrote that for this, he needed the skill. Not his strength, not his sword, his presence, at least for the duration of the certification. He placed the birch bark on a rock. He stood up, and before leaving, he added aloud. He said he wasn't ordering or asking. He was offering. If the skill was interested, he knew where to find Daniel. Silence. The wind. The rustling of trees. Daniel headed back. This time, the vibration didn't fade away. It followed him, about 100 meters behind, all the way to the village, like a shadow that hadn't yet decided to become visible. On the 12th day, the gatherers arrived, 3 of them, in the morning, while Daniel was at the training ground. He heard Hae-in scream from the courtyard and ran. His body was already in better shape. Not great, but better. He covered 50 meters in 10 seconds. A month ago, he wouldn't have been able to. 3 men were standing in the courtyard, burly, leather jackets. 2 of them had bandages. The third had a knife on his belt. All 3 were enforcers. Daniel could sense it. His body's memory told him so from their posture and the way they moved. Low-ranking, C or D, but stronger than any ordinary person. The oldest among them, broad-shouldered, bald, a scar on his chin. He was holding Hae-in by the hand, not painfully, but firmly. She was trying to break free. Min-ho stood behind her, pale, quiet. His eyes were huge. The bald man saw Daniel and smirked. He said that sleeping Dan had finally woken up. He said that Kung-sik sent his thanks for the 9 silver coins, but 3 were still owed, and interest, 5 silver coins by the end of the month. Daniel said he'd pay. The bald man laughed. He said he'd heard that from every debtor in the area. Then he turned serious. He said Kung-sik was tired of waiting, that if there was no money, there were other ways. He looked at Hae-in for a long time, appraisingly. He said the city was always in need of female workers, young ones, healthy ones. Herbalists are especially valued. Daniel held his breath for a second. Then he took a breath, slow, deep. He looked at the bald man's hand on his sister's wrist. Then he looked him in the eyes. He said he'd take his hand off his sister. His voice was steady, not loud, not angry, steady. The bald man looked at him. He saw a skinny guy with arms thinner than his baton, unarmed, without the skill, and he laughed. He said that Dan had made him laugh. He raised his free hand and shoved Daniel in the chest. Daniel flew back 2 steps. The difference in strength was enormous. Even a low-ranking carrier was 3 times stronger than an ordinary person. And Daniel wasn't even an ordinary person. He was an emaciated, former bedridden man. The bald man turned back to Hae-in. The second collector stepped toward Min-ho. He reached out his hand. The boy recoiled. Hae-in screamed. She broke free from his grip and shielded Min-ho with her body. The bald man raised his hand. He took a swing. Daniel stood 5 meters away, unarmed, powerless. And he did the only thing he could. He called out. Not with his voice, not with his mind, with something deeper. That emptiness in his chest where the skill had once lived. He reached out to her. For the first time ever, not like a master making a demand, like a person asking for help. Silence. A second. 2. The bald man was lowering his hand toward Hae-in, and then the air cracked, as if someone had torn the fabric of reality. The sound was such that all 3 gatherers flinched and turned around. A figure stood in the middle of the courtyard, 2 meters tall, made of gray light, without a distinct face, but with eyes, 2 glowing spots of white fire, and with a sword. The sword was longer than a man's height, gray as fog, and it radiated cold, skill, the Nameless Apprentice. But there was nothing apprentice-like left in him. He was enormous, powerful, The light pulsed beneath his surface like muscles beneath the skin. He looked at the three collectors and slowly raised his sword. The bald man let go of Hae-in. He took a step back. He was a bearer. He could sense power. And the power he sensed from this figure was such that his own skill inside his chest contracted and fell silent. This wasn't a D rank. Not even a B rank. It was something the bald man couldn't even begin to define. The skill was preparing to strike. Daniel could tell by his stance, by the way the gray body tensed, by the way the sword was glowing. One strike, and all that would remain of the three would be stains on the ground. Daniel raised his hand. An open palm. A stop sign. The skill froze. It turned its head toward Daniel. Its fiery eyes pulsed. It waited. Daniel spoke, calmly, clearly, as if he were assigning a task at the morning stand-up. He said, "Objective. Neutralize the threat to Hae-in and Min-ho within a 20-meter radius. Priority. Do not kill. Minimize noise. Deadline. 30 seconds. First, the one who swung at Hae-in. Break his right arm, the one he swung with. Second, the one who reached for Min-ho. Rip off his coin belt. Let him pick them up off the ground. Third, the one standing by the gate. Do nothing. He'll be the first to run." Skill tilted his head to one side, slowly, as if for the first time in his life he'd heard something new. Not an order, not a shout, not a plea, a task, with parameters, with priorities, with a deadline. He looked at the trio of collectors. He looked back at Daniel, and set off, quickly, so quickly that Daniel couldn't follow him with his eyes. A crunch. The bald man screamed. His right arm hung at an unnatural angle, the very one he'd swung at Hae-in. A clang. The second man's belt snapped. Coins scattered across the courtyard. Silver and copper coins rolled across the trampled earth. The collector stood with his mouth agape, staring down. Silence. The third man stood by the gate. Skill didn't even glance at him. The third man turned and ran. Fast, without looking back. Just as Daniel had predicted, the bald man pressed his broken arm to his chest. His face was pale, sweat beaded on his forehead. He looked at Skill with horror, then at Daniel. Daniel took 3 steps toward him. He said that the family owed 3 silver coins. He would pay in a week, in full, and after that, Kang-sik and his men would never show up near this house again. Never. If they did, next time Daniel wouldn't give him the job. He'd just leave, and Navik would figure it out for himself. The bald man nodded, quickly, repeatedly, like a fool. He picked up the second one from the yard. The third had already disappeared behind the hill. They left, quickly, limping, without looking back. The yard was empty. Ha-in stood by the wall of the house. She held Min-ho close to her. The boy was trembling. So was she. But her eyes weren't on the collectors. They were on the skill. He was still standing in the middle of the yard, huge, gray, glowing. His sword was lowered but hadn't disappeared. He turned toward Daniel. He tilted his head, those same eyes, like flames. And Daniel saw something in them. Not anger, not resentment, not indifference, surprise. Like a teenager who, for the first time in his life, wasn't told what to do, but was explained why. Skill stood there for 3 seconds. Then he nodded, slowly, just once. Not like a servant, not like a weapon, like a partner. One who had accepted the task and agreed with the method. He faded away, quietly, without a clatter. Not like before, when he'd vanish with a crash, as if he'd slammed a door. He simply melted away, like fog in the sun. The courtyard was empty. Only the second collector's coins glinted in the dust. Daniel exhaled. His hands were shaking. His knees felt like cotton. He sat down right on the ground. The adrenaline was wearing off, and his body reminded him that it was still weak and skinny, and not heroic at all. In approached. She crouched down beside him. Min-ho stood 3 steps away, staring with wide eyes. Hae-in asked quietly. She asked how he'd done it, how he'd made the skill return. Daniel shook his head. He said he hadn't forced it, he'd asked, and that the skill had come because it wanted to. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that the old Dan had also asked. He'd shouted, he'd begged, and skill hadn't come. Daniel looked at her. He said the difference wasn't in who was asking. The difference is in how. The old Dan asked to come back to him because he needed power. Daniel called for help because Hae-in was in danger. Skill heard the difference. Hae-in pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them. Small, tired, 16 years old, but she looks 20. She said she was scared, that she didn't understand what was happening, that her brother had changed, that Navik had returned, that everything had become different, and she didn't know if it was good or bad. Daniel placed his hand on her head, gently. The old Dan would never have done that. She flinched, but she didn't pull her head away. He said he didn't know either if it was good or bad, but that he was here, and that he wasn't going anywhere. She sat like that for a minute. Then she stood up. She brushed off her apron, and she went to gather the coins that the second collector had scattered. Practical, even in shock. 8 copper coins and 2 silver ones. Not bad. Daniel gathered the rest. Then he picked up the belt from the dust that Skill had torn. The cut was perfect, even, precise. Skill could have cut a person in half, but instead he tore the belt, because Daniel told him to, because the task had been clearly defined. He put the belt away in the shed. That evening, he didn't go to the edge of the forest. Instead, he sat down in the yard. He took out a birch bark sheet, and he didn't write a report, not metrics. He wrote an analysis, like after an incident at work. What happened? 3 collectors. A threat to his sister and brother. How he reacted. He called on Skill. He set the task. The result. The threat was neutralized. 0 casualties. Execution time, less than 10 seconds. What went well? Skill carried out the task exactly according to the parameters. Didn't overdo it. Didn't fall short. Perfect precision. What could be improved? Daniel's own reaction time. He realized too late that the collectors had arrived. An early warning system is needed. What was surprising? Navik arrived, quickly, without hesitation. Even though just a week ago he was only bringing in carcasses and watching from a distance. So the connection is growing faster than expected. Daniel placed the birch bark on the table in the yard, not on the stump by the forest, here, at home. He didn't know if Skill would come at night, but he wanted him to read it if he did. In the morning, the birch bark was gone from the table. In its place lay a small stone, black, smooth, warm. The core of the Nameless One, but not an ordinary one. This stone pulsed with a soft gray light, as if it had been charged. Daniel took it in his hand. The warmth spread through his fingers. Not scorching, cozy, like a mug of hot tea after a long day. He understood. This wasn't payment, not loot. It was a gift. The skill had left him a gift, the first in 4 years. Daniel stood in the middle of the courtyard with the warm stone in his hand and smiled. This wasn't a contract, not an exchange of services, not a boss and an employee. It was the beginning of something else, something the old Dan wasn't entitled to, but something Daniel had earned through 12 days of stubborn, honest work, trust. 2 weeks had passed since the day Skill nodded to Daniel in the courtyard. A lot had changed in those 2 weeks. His body had taken shape. Not the body of a warrior, but a worker's body. 100 sword strikes, 10 laps of running, 30 push-ups. Daniel kept track every morning and saw the growth curve, slow but steady, like a server load graph after optimization. The debt was paid off in full. Skill would bring in carcasses every other night. Not every night, every other one, as if he had his own schedule. Daniel sold the materials and paid off 3 silver coins plus interest. He went to Kaen-ni's office. He placed the coins on the table. A skinny assistant recorded the transaction in a ledger and looked at him with interest. He said the collectors had been talking about a huge gray figure and a broken arm. Daniel didn't say anything. He took the receipt, confirming the debt was paid off, and left. Now the money went toward food and supplies. For the first time in years, that Hae-in had cooked a meal with more than just one type of grain. Meat appeared on the table. Salt. Oil. Min-ho ate with gusto and began to grow. The 10-year-old boy, who was used to being quiet and inconspicuous, became a little louder. He started asking questions. He started going out into the yard when Daniel was training and watching. Skill was changing his behavior. He no longer just bring back carcasses. He began to show up, not for long, for a minute or two. In the evenings, Daniel would sit in the yard with his birch bark, writing reports and plans. And suddenly he'd feel a vibration. He'd look up. The Skill was standing by the fence, huge, gray, silent, watching. Daniel didn't jump up. He didn't call out. He didn't make any sudden movements. He just nodded. He said, "Good evening," and he kept writing. The ogre stood there for a minute, 2. Then he vanished. Every evening he stayed a little longer. A minute became 3. 3 became 5. By the 3rd week he began to appear during the day. Not for long, but he appeared. Hae-in saw him up close for the first time and turned pale. The Skill was enormous, 2 heads taller than Daniel. The sword on his back was longer than a person's height. His eyes, like flames, pulsed slowly. He looked at Hae-in. She was standing in the doorway, clutching the doorframe. The Skill tilted his head. Not menacingly, more like a big dog that sees a child and tries to look smaller. Then he vanished. Hae-in exhaled. Daniel could see she was afraid, not of him, of Skill. For 4 years, Skill had lived inside the former Dan's chest, small and quiet. Now he had become something else. Something that killed the Nameless with a single blow and broke people's arms on command. Daniel decided it was time to change his approach. He began writing reports not just for Skill. He started writing them aloud. In the evening, in the courtyard, when Skill appeared, Daniel would speak. He'd recount what he'd done that day. How many strikes, what metrics, what he'd bought at the market, what Hae-in had cooked for dinner, and how Min-ho had learned to chop wood and was proud of it. Skill listened, tilting his head. Sometimes he'd turn toward the house, as if checking to see if what Daniel was saying was true. Once, Daniel said he planned to start training with a real practice sword tomorrow. Not just striking a dummy, but basic stances and transitions. He said he knew 3 stances from the memory of his former body, but wasn't sure he was doing them correctly. Skill stood by the fence and listened. Then he took a step forward. Daniel froze. Skill had never come closer than 5 meters. Now he was standing 3 meters away. He slowly raised his hand, without a sword, an empty gray palm made of mist and light, and demonstrated the stance, slowly, precisely. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, center of gravity low, arms in front of him. Daniel watched, memorized it, repeated it, awkwardly. Skill tilted his head, demonstrated it again. Daniel repeated it. Better. Skill nodded, once. And then he vanished. Daniel held the stance for another minute. Then he wrote down everything he could remember. Skill had taught him, not on orders, not under contract. He saw that Daniel was trying to train on his own and doing it wrong. And he decided to help, on his own. It was more than a nod, more than a gift. It was the beginning of what Daniel would call mentoring at work. A senior helping a junior. Not because he had to, but because he sees potential. Over the next week, Namek showed him 5 basic stances and 2 transitions between them. Every evening, 2 or 3 minutes. Then he'd disappear. Daniel practiced during the day. By the end of the 3rd week, his strikes on the dummy had changed. Not stronger, but more precise, cleaner. His body remembered what Namek had shown him. His muscle memory was kicking in. Slowly, but it was working. On the 23rd day, a stranger arrived in the village. A man in his 30s. A gray cloak, a hood, a quiet gait. He appeared in the morning and headed for the village headman's house. Daniel saw him from the training ground. Something about this man's gait struck him as wrong, too smooth, too confident for a traveler. He asked Hae-in. She turned pale. She said it might be a guild scout. Before the Inquisition's visit, they sometimes send people to check out the situation. Daniel felt a chill in his chest. In that very empty spot where Skill had once lived, According to Elder Park's calculations, there was a week left before the Inquisition's visit. If the scout had arrived early, it meant something had alerted them. Maybe rumors of a giant skill in the forest. Maybe the collector's report about a gray silhouette that breaks arms. Daniel left the clearing. He went to the house. He sat down at the table and thought. There were two options. First, run. Take Hae-in and Min-ho and leave. But where? He had no money for a long journey, no connections, no place to hide. And Hae-in wouldn't abandon the farm. It's all she has. Option 2. Stay and bluff. Pretend to be an ordinary carrier with an ordinary skill. The problem is, the skill doesn't reside in his chest. Any average guild member would sense that the slot was empty, and a scout would surely be trained to check for that. The third option came to him as he looked at the charged core that the skill had left him as a gift. The stone was still warm. It pulsed with a gray light, and that light was identical to skills. Daniel took the core and pressed it against his chest, against the empty slot. The warmth spread across his ribs, not like the living skill, but like its echo, like a plug in a port. If someone checked it casually, they'd feel warmth and a faint energy, not emptiness. It wouldn't be enough for a thorough check, but for a cursory one, it might work. Daniel tied the core to his chest with a strip of cloth, under his shirt. The warmth was steady and constant, like a hot water bottle. He stepped out into the courtyard. Ha-in was standing by the gate, looking toward the village head's house. Daniel told her they needed to act normal. Don't hide. Don't get nervous. He's an ordinary carrier with an ordinary skill. Weak. Rank D. He's training. No excommunication. Ha-in nodded. She knew how to keep quiet. 4 years of practice. A scout came to them after lunch. He knocked on the gate. Polite. He introduced himself as Yun-tae-ho, said he was from the guild's office. He was conducting a census of bearers in the region ahead of the fall certification. Standard procedure. Daniel invited him into the courtyard, offered him some water. Yun sat down on a bench and took a notebook out of his bag. He asked for a name, skill, rank. Daniel answered calmly. Seo Dan, Nameless Apprentice, rank D. Yun wrote it down. Then he looked up. He said the head of the village had mentioned that Dan had resumed training, and that there were rumors of a major skill in the forest. Did Dan know anything about it? Daniel shrugged his shoulders. He said he'd heard about it, that the hunters had seen it, but that his rank D skill and the 2-meter-tall gray silhouette were unlikely to have anything to do with him. Yun smiled, subtly, professionally, and asked permission to check the slot. Standard procedure. Daniel nodded. Yun placed his palm on Daniel's chest. Daniel felt the stranger's energy push its way inside, not roughly, gently, like a probe checking a connection. The energy touched the core beneath the fabric. The core responded with warmth, faint, steady, like a dormant, low-rank skill. Yun withdrew his hand. He nodded, jotted something down in his book, said everything was fine, wished him luck on the certification, and left. Daniel stood in the courtyard and watched as the gray cloak disappeared around the corner. His hands weren't shaking, his face was calm, but inside, everything was tightening up. The bluff had worked. This time. But Daniel knew it was only a temporary measure. The core could fool a cursory check, but not a thorough one. A well-trained Inquisitor would see right through him in a second. He needed something else. He needed the skill to return to his chest, not completely, at least for the duration of the checks, at least for a little while. But for that, he needed trust, and he didn't have enough of it yet. That evening, the skill appeared by the fence, as usual. Daniel was sitting in the yard, but this time he wasn't writing a report. He was just sitting there, watching at the sunset. 2 suns were setting behind the hills, one after the other. First the small yellow one, then the big white one. The sky turned orange and then purple, beautiful. Daniel hadn't noticed it before. He'd been too busy with plans and metrics. The skill stood there, watching the sunset too. 2 beings, one of flesh and blood, the other of light and mist. Both watched the sun set in silence. Daniel spoke up, not about training, not about plans. He told him about the scout, honestly. He said a guild member had come by, that he'd checked the slot, that Daniel had tricked him with a core, and that next time the trick wouldn't work. Skill turned his head. His eyes throbbed. He listened. Daniel said he needed help, that an Inquisitor might arrive in a week, that if the Inquisitor saw an empty slot, they'd burn him, his family, and maybe the whole village. He said he wasn't asking Skill to return to his chest forever. He wasn't asking him to obey. He was asking him to come out just for the duration of the inspection. 10 minutes. 5. As long as he could. And then to go back. Free. No strings attached. The Skill stood there for a long time. A minute. 2. Then he took a step. Another one. He came right up close. For the first time ever, Daniel felt cold and warmth at the same time, like standing next to a campfire in winter. The Skill reached out a hand. A gray palm emerged from the fog and touched Daniel's chest, right on top of the empty slot. Daniel flinched. The sensation was strange, as if someone had knocked on a door that had been locked for 4 years. The Skill didn't come in. It knocked, it checked, and it withdrew its hand. It turned and vanished. Daniel stood there, breathing. The warmth remained in his chest. Not the core, real warmth. Faint, like an echo, but alive. The Skill was checking to see if it could return, to see if the lock had rusted shut, whether the door was jammed. Daniel smiled. In the language of development, this was called a ping. The Skill sent a request to the server, and the server responded. The Inquisitor arrived 5 days later, not a week as Daniel had expected, sooner. He arrived on horseback, accompanied by 2 guild soldiers. Daniel saw them from the hill where he was gathering firewood. 3 horsemen on the road from Kaen-ni, guild crests on their cloaks. The horseman in the lead had a different crest, not the guild's blue shield, a red sword on a black field, the Inquisition. Daniel froze. Then he calmly gathered his bundle and headed into the woods, not running, at a walk. Hurrying attracts attention. The horseman rode into the village and stopped at the village headman's house. Daniel walked past them at a distance of 30 meters. He didn't look in their direction. He kept his eyes on the road. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the one in front. Young, about 25, dark, closely cropped hair, a clean-shaven face, no scars, no sign of fatigue. His eyes were alert and calm. His uniform was impeccable, a red cloak without a single crease. The sword at his belt wasn't just for show. The hilt was worn smooth from frequent use. This wasn't Marcus Hale. His memory told him that Hale was older and taller. This one was different. A junior Inquisitor, maybe an intern, but that didn't make it any easier. Even an Inquisition intern is trained to thoroughly inspect a slot. The core on his chest wouldn't help. Daniel came home. Hae-in already knew. A neighbor had run over and told her. 3 horsemen with guild crests, 1 Inquisitor. She stood in the kitchen, mechanically sorting through herbs. Her hands were shaking. Min-ho sat in the corner, silent. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could sense his sister's fear. Daniel sat down at the table. He closed his eyes. He reached for the empty slot in his chest, the place where, 5 days ago, the Skill had left an echo of warmth. The echo was faint, but alive. Daniel reached for it, not with a command, not with an order, but with a thought. A simple and he needed help. Now. 1 minute. Silence. 2. Hae-in looked at him. 3. The warmth in his chest stirred, as if someone on the other side of the door had heard the knock and come closer. Daniel opened his eyes. He looked at Hae-in. He told her they had to wait. She nodded. She didn't know what they were waiting for, but she nodded. An hour passed. The Inquisitor was making his rounds through the village. Daniel had heard it from the neighbors. He was checking every house, every carrier. He'd place his hand on their chest and check the slot. He was going in order. Their house was the 9th out of 12. Maybe 2 hours until the visit. Maybe 3. Daniel went out into the yard. He sat down on a bench. And then he sensed it. Not a vibration, a presence. The skill was nearby. Not by the fence, not 100 meters away. Right nearby, behind the shed wall. Daniel didn't turn around. He spoke quietly. He explained the situation. An Inquisitor in the village. He'll be here in 2 hours. A slot check. A thorough one. The core won't lie. The skill needs to enter the slot, at least for the duration of the check. 5 minutes. After that, he's free. Silence. Then a rustle. Skill emerged from behind the shed. He didn't vanish and reappear. He walked out, step by step, like a human, huge, gray, a sword on his back. He stood 3 meters away from Daniel and looked at him. His eyes were pulsing faster than usual. Daniel saw something familiar in that pulse. Indecision. The skill wanted to help, but he was afraid. For 4 years he'd lived in this slot, and for 4 years it had been like a prison. A master who didn't notice him, didn't speak to him, didn't give him any tasks. Emptiness, boredom, oblivion. Returning to the slot meant returning to a cage, even if only for 5 minutes. Even if the cage now belonged to someone else. Daniel understood. He stood up, took a step forward, said he knew what skill was afraid of, and that he was right to be afraid. 4 years in the void is no joke. He said he wouldn't pretend to understand what it was like. He didn't understand. But he promised one thing, 5 minutes, not a second more. And inside, he wouldn't stay silent. He would speak. He would tell him what was happening outside, like an open channel of communication. Navik wouldn't be locked in silence. Navik stood there. The pulsing in his eyes slowed. 1 minute. Then he reached out, touched Daniel's chest, and entered. It felt as if a warm wave had surged into his chest and filled every cell. Daniel gasped, not from pain, from fullness, as if he'd been breathing with only one lung his whole life, and now the second one had kicked in. He felt the skill inside him, a living presence, warm, enormous, restless. The skill tossed and turned inside him like a large beast in a small room. It was cramped, uncomfortable. It had grown too big for this space, like an outgrown child who had returned to his crib. Daniel did as he promised. He began to speak, quietly, inside, not with his lips, with his thoughts. He described what he saw: the yard, the fence, the sky, Hae-in at the window, Min-ho at the table, the neighbor's rooster on the roof. He could feel skill listening, how the anxiety was subsiding, how the confinement was becoming a little less confining. Not because the slot had widened, because a voice had appeared inside. An hour and a half had passed. The Inquisitor was already in the neighboring house. Daniel heard voices through the wall, then footsteps, a knock at the gate. Hae-in opened it. The Inquisitor entered the yard. Up close, he looked even younger than he had from a distance. 23, maybe 24. A clean-cut face, neat hands. But her eyes weren't young. There was something hard and confident in them. The eyes of someone who knows they're right. She introduced herself. Trainee Inquisitor So-ra. Daniel blinked. It was a woman. Her short hair and uniform concealed her figure, but her voice gave her away. Low for a woman, yet unmistakably feminine. So-ra, bearer of the skill Scales of Truth, a skill that sensed lies. Daniel felt the skill tense inside his chest. He sensed her too. He sensed her skill. So-ra surveyed the courtyard. She looked at the training area, at the dummy, at the wooden swords. She nodded. She asked him to present his slot. Standard procedure. Daniel nodded. So-ra placed her palm on his chest. And at that moment, several things happened at once. Her energy entered the slot. It was foreign, cold, precise, like a scalpel. She was searching for the skill, and she found it. The Nameless Apprentice was there, alive, warm, powerful, too powerful for a D rank. Daniel saw her eyes widen slightly. She sensed the power, a true rank, not D, not even B, something higher. She removed her hand, slowly. She looked at Daniel. He waited. She was silent. She took out her notebook. She wrote it down. With Dan, the Nameless Apprentice. She closed the notebook. She said everything was fine, and she left. Daniel stood there, motionless. She sensed it. She definitely sensed it. A rank D skill doesn't radiate that kind of energy. She knew that something was wrong, but she wrote down, "Everything's fine." Why? A minute later, the skill popped out of the slot, on its own, without waiting for permission. It materialized in the courtyard. It was breathing heavily. If a creature of gray light can even breathe heavily. He'd been inside for almost 2 hours, much longer than 5 minutes, much longer than Daniel had promised, and he hadn't left earlier. He'd stayed because he knew the test was still going on. Daniel looked at him, said thank you, seriously, without a smile, said that skill had stayed inside longer than they'd agreed, that it had been hard, that he'd seen it, and that he'd remember it. Skill looked at him, nodded, and vanished, quietly, without a crash, gently. Daniel sat down on a bench. His hands were shaking, but not from fear, from what he'd been feeling inside for the past 2 hours. Navik was alive, real, thinking, feeling. Daniel could hear him in there. Not words, sensations, anxiety, discomfort, determination, and something else. Something like a quiet, stubborn attachment, like a cat that pretends not to care but always sleeps at the feet of the same person. Hae-in came out. She asked if everything was all right. Daniel said yes. Then he asked why the Inquisitor had recorded that everything was fine, even though she must have sensed that the rank wasn't D. Hae-in shrugged. She didn't know. Daniel didn't know either, but he remembered Kim So-ra's face, and her skill, scales of truth, a skill that senses lies. If she hadn't reported it, it meant she'd either decided to check later, or had seen something that made her change her mind. Either way, she'd be back. So-ra returned 3 days later. Alone, without soldiers, without her Inquisition uniform, in simple traveling clothes, with a sword at her belt but without a coat of arms. She had walked all the way from Kaen-ni and knocked on the gate that morning. Daniel opened it himself. He saw her and realized the wait was over. She stood at the gate and looked at him. Her eyes were cold, but not hostile. Rather, they were appraising. Like a scientist looking at an anomaly and deciding whether to study it or destroy it. She said she hadn't come as an Inquisitor, that she'd sent a report on the village noting that everything was clear, that her superiors didn't know she was here, and that she had questions to which she wanted honest answers. Daniel invited her into the courtyard. Hae-in saw the Inquisitor and turned pale. Daniel gestured to her that everything was fine. Hae-in went back inside, but he knew she was standing behind the door, listening. So-ra sat down on a bench. Daniel sat across from her. She said that his skill wasn't D rank. She didn't know the exact rank, but the energy she sensed in his slot corresponded to upper A or lower S. In the 6 years since, a rise from D to A had never once occurred in the history of Haerion. In the past 10 years, it had happened twice. Both cases were excommunications. The skill would leave its host and return dozens of times stronger, and both hosts were dead within a month. She fell silent. She waited for a response. Daniel thought. Her skill sensed the lie, so lying was pointless. A half-truth wouldn't work either. That left 2 options: to remain silent or to tell the truth. He chose a third, to tell the truth but not the whole truth. He said that his skill had left 4 months ago. That was true. That the skill had returned 3 weeks ago, partially true. The skill hadn't returned to the slot, but it had returned as a presence. That there was a new relationship between them, not master and tool, partners, true. So-ra listened. Her eyes didn't change. Her skill was silent, so it didn't sense a lie, because Daniel wasn't lying. She asked why he hadn't died. All the exiled ones had died. Daniel replied that he didn't know why the others had died, but he knew why he himself had survived. Because he hadn't clung to his skill as if it were his property. He let it go, and the skill returned on its own. So-ra frowned. This didn't fit into her worldview. Skills don't return of their own accord. Skills either obey or leave. There is no third option. That's what she'd been taught. She asked if she could see it. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he nodded. He stepped out into the middle of the courtyard. He reached for the connection, not to the slot, to the vibration, to the channel they'd been building for 3 weeks. The skill. It didn't call. It didn't ask. It reported. "The Inquisitor is here. She wants to see. I believe it's safe. The decision is yours." Silence. 5 seconds. 10. So-ra stood nearby, her hand on her sword. Instinct. And then the air behind Daniel shifted. The skill appeared. Not with a crash, not with a crack, quietly, like a breath. 2 meters tall, gray, with a sword on his back. He stood behind Daniel's shoulder and looked at So-ra. She took a step back. Her hand gripped the hilt. Her own skill inside her fluttered like a bird in a cage. Daniel could see it on her face. The scales of truth sensed the power of the nameless disciple and reacted like a small animal in the presence of a large predator. The skill didn't move. It just stood there, watching. So-ra stood like that for half a minute. Then she slowly removed her hand from the sword. She exhaled. She said she now understood why the energy had been like that. She said it was impossible, that a skill of this level cannot exist separately from its master and cannot obey of its own free will. Daniel shrugged. He said that it doesn't obey, it cooperates. So-ra looked at the skill, then at Daniel. She asked how they differed. Obedience and cooperation. What's the difference? Daniel said the difference was simple. With obedience, the skill does what it's told. With cooperation, the skill does what it deems right after they've discussed the task. If he disagrees, he can refuse. And sometimes, he does refuse. So-ra was silent for a long time. Then she said that was heresy, that the guild considers skills to be extensions of their masters, not separate beings, not individuals. That the entire system is built on the premise that a skill obeys. If skills start making their own decisions, the whole structure will collapse. Daniel said that maybe the structure should collapse. So-ra looked at him. Something had changed in her eyes. Not agreement, but interest. Like that of a person who had lived their whole life in a room with a single window and suddenly discovered there was a door. She didn't step through that door, but she looked at it. The skill behind Daniel tilted his head. He looked at So-ra, then at Daniel, and did something new. He sat down. He sank to the ground. He crossed his legs. He placed his sword on his lap. Like a man who decided to stay and listen to the conversation, So-ra stared at him with wide-open eyes. Skills didn't sit down. Skills either stood or vanished. Skills were weapons, not conversation partners. And this one was sitting on the ground in the courtyard of a village house, looking at the Inquisitor with an expression that could be described as lazy curiosity. Daniel suppressed a smile. The skill was revealing its character, demonstratively, as if to say, "I'm not a tool, and here's the proof." So-ra sat back down on the bench, slowly, like someone who needed to rethink the last 20 years of her life. She asked how Daniel had done it, how he'd mended his relationship with the skill that had left. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he answered. He said he'd stopped treating it as a tool. He'd started treating it as a person. He gave it tasks instead of orders. He wrote reports instead of demanding results. He praised him when there was a reason to. He offered constructive criticism. He gave him freedom. And most importantly, he listened. So-ra was silent. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, that her skill was silent too. That the scales of truth worked properly. They could sense lies in others, but they didn't speak to her. They'd never spoken. She thought that was how it was for everyone. That a skill was a function, not a being. Daniel looked at her. He asked if she'd ever tried asking her skill how it was doing. So-ra blinked. No, she hadn't tried. Who asks a sword how it's doing? Daniel said maybe she should try. She stood up. She adjusted the sword at her belt. She said she'd be back, not as an inquisitor, but as a person who wants to understand. Daniel nodded. She left. Skill sat in the courtyard for another 10 minutes after she left. Then he stood up. He looked at Daniel, and he did something he hadn't done before. He snorted. The sound was quiet, like a breath exhaled through the nose, almost human. Daniel laughed. Skill didn't like the Inquisitor. Or maybe it was the other way around. She had amused him. It was hard to tell. Skill vanished. But this time, Daniel sensed that he hadn't gone far. Not into the forest, somewhere nearby. Behind the shed, maybe. Or on the roof. Closer than ever. A month had passed since Daniel's awakening. His body had changed. Not powerful, but alive. Lean muscles had emerged beneath his skin. His endurance had tripled. 150 sword strikes, 20 laps of running, 50 push-ups. Daniel recorded his progress every morning and watched the curve transform from a flat line into a steady ascent. The skill no longer appeared only in the evenings. It came in the mornings and afternoons as well, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. He sat on the shed roof and watched Daniel train. Sometimes he'd come down and demonstrate a new technique, silently, through movement alone. Daniel would repeat it, and the skill would refine itself. In a month, Daniel had mastered 8 basic stances and 5 transitions. That was the level of a first-year guild member. Not much for a 20-year-old. But for a man who, a month ago, couldn't even lift a training sword, it was a miracle. The evaluation was in a month. Daniel was preparing, not for combat, for a presentation. He was going to show the guild something they'd never seen before. Not strength, not technique, partnership. On the 35th day, in the afternoon, a woman arrived at the farm. It was that same mercenary from the tavern in Kaen-ni, tall, a scar across her eyebrow, 2 short swords at her belt, gray, weary eyes, Ember Cain. She stood at the gate and looked as if she hadn't slept for 3 days. Daniel opened the gate. She looked down at him. She said she'd heard about a guy from So-ra who had a strange skill, that she needed help. Daniel invited her into the courtyard. Hae-in brought out some water. Amber drank it in one gulp. Then she spoke. Her skill was called Double Shadow, Combat, Rank B. It created a shadow double that mirrored its master's movements. 2 blades instead of 1. 2 fighters instead of 1. Amber had been a mercenary for 10 years, since she was 13. Training camp, contracts, assassinations, security, dirty jobs that normal people wouldn't take. She and Double Shadow worked like a machine, in sync, efficiently, without a hitch, until 3 months ago. 3 months ago, she took a contract. A merchant hired her to kill a competitor, a family man, 2 kids. Amber didn't ask any questions. She never asked any questions. She went in at night. Double Shadow had her back covered. Everything went smoothly, quickly, quietly. She left, got paid, and then Double Shadow fell silent. She didn't leave. She didn't run away. She fell silent. She stopped responding in battle. She stopped creating a double. Amber summoned her, and instead of a double, a dim shadow appeared that stood motionless and didn't react, like a soldier who refused to follow an order. Didn't desert, just stood there and remained silent. Amber went to the healers. She went to the guild masters. Everyone said the skill was damaged, that it would take time, that intensive training was needed, that she had to reclaim control of it through sheer willpower. She'd tried everything. Nothing worked. The Double Shadow remained silent. Daniel listened. When Amber fell silent, he didn't speak right away. He thought. Then he asked. She'd said the skill used to work like a machine. 10 years, without a single glitch. Had she ever asked the skill what it thought about the orders? Amber frowned. She said no. Why would she? The skill is a tool. You don't ask a sword if it likes to cut. Daniel nodded. He said that was the problem. For 10 years, the Double Shadow had carried out orders, including orders she didn't like. She couldn't refuse because Amber was a strong mistress with a strong will. Skill obeyed, endured. 10 years. And then her patience ran out. The contract to kill a family man was the last straw. Double Shadow isn't damaged, she's offended. She refuses to work because no one ever asked her if she wanted to. Amber looked at him as if he'd said the earth was flat. Skills don't take offense. Skills don't have opinions. That's just how the world works. Daniel said the world was set up wrong. Amber was silent for a long time. Then she asked what to do. Daniel said they needed to talk. Not to him, to the skill. Amber laughed. Briefly, bitterly. She said it was nonsense, that you can't talk to a shadow. Daniel stood up. He asked her to go out to the middle of the yard, to summon the skill, right now. Amber looked at him doubtfully, but she went out. She stood up. She closed her eyes. She concentrated. A shadow appeared at her feet, dull, pale, barely noticeable. It didn't rise to its full height. It lay on the ground like spilled water, lifeless, silent. Amber opened her eyes. She said, "There, that's all I can do." Daniel crouched down next to the shadow. He looked at her. The shadow didn't move, but Daniel could see that it wasn't dead. It wasn't damaged. It lay on the ground of its own accord, like a person who had lain down on the floor and refused to get up. A protest. Passive, silent, but a protest nonetheless. Daniel turned to Amber. He told her she needed to sit on the ground, next to the shadow, and tell it that she was to blame, not the skill. Her, Amber. For 10 years, she'd used the skill as a tool and never once considered that a tool might have feelings, that the last contract had been a mistake and that she was sorry. Amber stood there. Her face was stony. She wasn't used to apologizing. She'd been a weapon since she was 13. Weapons don't apologize. Daniel said he understood, that it was hard, but that the double shadow had been waiting 10 years for a single word. Just one. I'm sorry. Amber clenched her teeth. Her jaw tensed. Her hands clenched into fists. She stood like that for a minute. Then, as abruptly as if she were jumping into cold water, she dropped to her knees, next to the shadow. The shadow didn't move. Amber spoke. Her voice was hoarse and quiet. She said she'd never thought that the skill could feel, that she'd been taught that a skill is part of its host, and a part doesn't have a mind of its own, that she'd been wrong, that the last contract was dirty and she knew it, and that she was sorry. Silence. The shadow on the ground twitched, just a little, like a ripple on the water from a falling stone. Amber saw it and froze. Then she continued. Her voice cracked. She said she hadn't asked in 10 years, not once. Do you want to? Do you like it? Does it hurt you? She just gave orders and waited for them to be carried out. And if the double shadow decided not to return, she would understand, because she deserved it. The shadow rose, slowly, like a person who had been lying down for a long time and had lost their strength. It rose to its knees, to its waist, to its shoulders. She stood up to her full height, faded, slender, but standing tall. Amber looked up at her. Her eyes were wet. She hadn't cried in 10 years. Daniel stood to the side and said nothing. This was their moment, not his. The double shadow looked at Amber, dark eyes on a dark face, and slowly reached out her hand. Amber raised hers. Their palms touched. The shadow grew slightly brighter, not completely, not like before, but brighter. Amber exhaled. She sniffled, once, briefly, as if something she'd been holding inside for 10 years had finally burst out of her. Then she stood up. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at Daniel. Her face was wet, angry, and confused all at once. She said he was unbearable. Daniel shrugged. He said that's what he'd been told. Amber stood in the yard for another minute. The double shadow was nearby, but alive. Then the shadow dissolved, returning to its host. Amber shuddered and pressed her hand to her chest. Warmth, for the first time in 3 months. She looked at Daniel and asked who he was and how he knew all this. Daniel said he was Seo Dan, from the village of Seoul, a bearer of the Nameless Disciple skill, and that he'd spent his whole life working with people who pretended they had no feelings until they broke. Amber snorted. She was silent for a moment. Then she said that if he ever needed someone with 2 swords to watch his back, she'd owe him one. Daniel said he'd remember. She left. Hae-in came out of the house. She'd heard everything. She stood in the doorway and looked at Daniel. Then she spoke quietly. She said that he'd fixed a stranger in half an hour, but he'd been with her for a month and hadn't once asked how she was doing. Daniel froze. She was right. He'd been doing things for her. He'd bought her boots, fixed the fence, cooked meals, paid off her debts, but not once in a month had he sat down with her and asked, just like that, like a human being. How are you? How do you feel? What do you need? Not things, not actions, attention. He walked around the yard and sat down on the bench next to her. He asked how she was. Hae-in was silent for a minute. Then she began to speak, quietly, slowly, like someone who hadn't had a real conversation with anyone in a very long time. Hae-in spoke for 2 hours. Daniel sat and listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't take notes. He just listened. She told him that her mother had died 3 years ago from an illness that Silent Stitch couldn't cure. He patched up wounds, but he was powerless against the disease. Hae-in sat beside her, stitching up the cracks in her mother's skin caused by the fever, while everything inside was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do. Her father had left even earlier, when Dan was 14 and she was 12. He'd gone to the capital to find work and never returned. A year later, a letter arrived from someone. Her father had died at the Rift, the Nameless Ones. There were no details. Hae-in was left with her lazy older brother and her younger brother Min-ho, who was 7 at the time. For 3 years, she kept the farm going. She sold herbs. She treated neighbors for a few coins. She mended clothes. She cooked. She cleaned. She raised Min-ho. And every morning she climbed up to the hayloft to check if her older brother was still alive. She didn't say she was angry. She didn't say she felt wronged. She stated the facts, in an even voice, like a report. Daniel listened and understood. She had grown so used to being strong that she'd forgotten how to show weakness. Even now, when she was finally telling him, she did it as if it were a job, like just another duty she had to fulfill. When she fell silent, Daniel didn't say that everything would be all right. He didn't make any promises. He didn't try to comfort her. He said one thing. He said she'd made it through. 3 years on her own, 16 years, and everything was still standing. The farm was still standing. Min-ho was growing up. Dan was alive. She'd made it through. And now she wasn't alone. Hae-in sat there in silence. Then she nodded. She stood up. She went into the house. A minute later, Daniel heard a soft sound. Not crying, something quieter, as if she'd finally allowed herself to breathe a sigh of relief. He stayed on the bench and watched the sunset. Navi appeared on the roof of the barn. He sat there, watching the sunset too. 2 suns, one after the other. Orange, purple, silence. The following days were spent preparing for the certification. Daniel drew up a plan. Not a combat plan, a presentation plan. Certification in the guild consisted of 3 stages. First, demonstration of the skill. The bearer summons the skill and demonstrates it before the committee. Strength, stability, and control are evaluated. Second, combat test. The bearer, using their skill, faces a training opponent. Effectiveness and technique are evaluated. Third, interview. The committee asks questions about the candidate's plans, goals, and understanding of their skill. The first stage is simple. The skill will manifest. Powerful, impressive. The problem is that it's too powerful for a candidate with a D rank. This will raise questions. Daniel decided that honesty was the best approach. The skill has grown. That's a fact. How and why is a matter open to debate. The second stage is more complicated. The skill is strong, but Daniel couldn't control it in the traditional sense. He didn't issue combat commands. He set tasks, and the skill carried them out in its own way. To the committee, this would look like a lack of control, or like a new form of control. It depends on how you present it. The third stage, the interview. This was where Daniel felt most confident. He'd conducted hundreds of interviews in his past life, on both sides of the table. He knew how to sell an idea, how to speak confidently about things that sounded crazy. He practiced his speech every evening. Skill sat on the roof and listened. Sometimes he tilted his head. Sometimes he snorted. Once, he jumped down from the roof and stood next to Daniel as he rehearsed a line about partnership. Daniel fell silent. Skill looked at him, raised his hand, extended his index finger, tapped Daniel on the chest, gently, then tapped himself, then raised both fingers together. Daniel watched. Skill demonstrated. You, me, together. Daniel nodded. Skill nodded back. Then he vanished. The agreement was sealed. Not with words, not with a contract on birch bark, with a gesture. Skill would go to the certification with him. Not because he had to, because he'd decided to. A week before the certification, So-ra came again. This time she looked different. Not cold, not judgmental, confused. She sat down on a bench in the courtyard and was silent for 5 minutes. Then she said she'd tried. She asked her skill how he was doing. Daniel asked what had happened. So-ra said the scales of truth had answered, for the first time in 6 years. She asked how things were, and Skill showed her an image. Not words, an image. She saw herself, through Skill's eyes. A little girl who pressed her palms to her temples and screamed because she could sense the lies of everyone around her and couldn't turn it off. 12 years old, her first year with the skill. The scales of truth had activated, and So-ra began to sense every lie from everyone around her. Her parents, her teachers, her friends. Everyone was lying. Everyone. Constantly. And So-ra didn't know how to live with it. She withdrew into herself. She joined the Inquisition because at least there, her ability had a purpose. But in 6 years, she never once considered that the scales of truth felt it too. That every time she sensed a lie, the ability felt the same thing, the same pain, the same disappointment. In silence, Daniel listened. Then he asked what the skill had shown her else. So-ra fell silent. Then she said that the skill had shown her Daniel, his courtyard. The moment of the test when So-ra placed her hand on his chest. So-ra's skill showed her what he was feeling at that moment. Inside Daniel, there were two, the host and the skill, side by side, neither subordinate to the other, side by side, like two people in the same room. The scales of truth had shown So-ra that this was possible, and that in 6 years, no one had ever stood beside her like that. So-ra fell silent. Daniel did too. They sat in silence. Then So-ra said she was going to the certification, as an observer for the Inquisition, and that if Daniel was planning to demonstrate anything unusual there, she'd better know about it in advance, so she wouldn't have to arrest him according to protocol. Daniel explained his plan. So-ra listened. When he finished, she said that he would either be accepted into the guild as the first in 1,000 years, or burned at the stake in the town square. The odds were roughly even. Daniel said he was used to working with odds like that. Every new product launch was a 50-50 shot. So-ra didn't get the reference, but she nodded. She left. There were 7 days left until the certification. Daniel trained. Skill came every day. They weren't practicing combat. They were practicing coordination. Daniel gave the command with his voice. Skill carried it out. Quickly, precisely. Then Daniel changed the conditions on the fly. Skill adapted. It readjusted. Without argument. Without hesitation. Like a well-coordinated team that has worked together for so long that words are no longer necessary. Once, during training, Skill stopped in the middle of a move. It turned toward the forest. Daniel sensed it through their connection. Alarm. Skill vanished. Daniel waited. Half an hour later, Skill returned. He brought a small creature. Not a nameless one. Something else. Small. Glowing with a faint blue light. The size of a kitten. With big eyes. It was trembling. Skill set it down on the ground in front of Daniel. Gently. Like an adult carrying a child. Daniel crouched down. The creature looked at him. Its eyes were blue and moist. It squeaked softly, frightened. Daniel understood. It was a skill, an alien, small, just hatched or very young, without an owner, alone in the forest, lost, or runaway, or cast out. He looked at his own skill. It stood nearby, watching the little creature. In its fiery eyes was something like recognition, like an older one seeing itself in a younger one. Daniel picked up the creature, warm, trembling, alive. He carried it into the house. Hae-in saw it and gasped. Then she brought a blanket. They settled the little skill by the stove. It curled up into a ball and fell asleep. Daniel stood there watching it. There it was. The beginning of what he'd been thinking but hadn't dared to say out loud. Skills are leaving their owners. Not just his skill, others too. And not all of them die. And not all of them disappear. Some end up alone, small, frightened, defenseless. Daniel turned to Hae-in. He said that after the certification, they'd have to talk about expanding the farm. Hae-in looked at him, then at the sleeping skill by the stove, then back at Daniel. She asked if he was planning to round up homeless skills like stray cats. Daniel thought for a moment. He said the comparison wasn't perfect, but overall, yes. The certification took place in Kaen-ni, in the square in front of the guild building. Daniel arrived early in the morning. Hae-in walked beside him. She was wearing new boots and a clean dress. Min-ho held her hand and looked around in all directions. He had never been to the city before. The square was filled with people. candidates for the certification, their families, onlookers, and vendors who had set up food stalls against the walls. The commission sat on a platform in the center of the square, 5 people. 4 guildmasters in blue robes, and 1 in red, the Inquisitor, not So-ra, older, around 40, graying temples, a stern face, a red sword emblem on his chest. The name rang out when the town crier announced the committee. Inquisitor Victor Lowe, Marcus Hale's deputy. Daniel felt a chill in his stomach. Hale's deputy. That was worse than an intern, much worse. So-ra stood off to the side among the observers. She met Daniel's gaze for a second. Her face was impassive, but her eyes spoke volumes. Be careful. There were 23 candidates. Daniel signed up last, on purpose. He wanted to see how the others performed, to understand the format, to find the committee's weak spots. Stage 1. Demonstration. The candidates came out one by one. They were called up to demonstrate a skill. The committee evaluated them. Most were young, 15 to 17 years old, their first certification. Their skills were minor and tentative, rank C and D. One guy demonstrated a rank B skill. The committee nodded approvingly. The crowd applauded. Daniel watched and memorized. The skills appeared on command. They stood motionless, like soldiers at a review. The masters gave commands, and the skills performed simple actions. A strike, a block, a parry. Everything was mechanical, precise, soulless. Not a single skill moved of its own accord. Not a single one looked around. Not a single one showed any character. Tools, every single one of them. Daniel was 23rd. The herald announced his name. Seo Dan, from the village of So-ra. Skill, Nameless Apprentice. Rank, D. Someone in the crowd snorted. Rank D at the certification. Why even bother coming? Daniel stepped onto the platform. He stood before the commission. Inquisitor Lowe looked at him without interest. Rank D wasn't worth the Inquisitor's attention. The commission's senior master nodded. He said the demonstration could begin. Daniel didn't summon his skill with a command. He didn't reach for the slot. He didn't issue an order. He turned toward the empty space to his right, and he spoke, out loud, in front of everyone. He said he was ready, that the commission was waiting, that it was safe here, and that the decision was up to them. Silence. The crowd exchanged glances. The commission frowned. The master asked who Daniel was talking to. Daniel said he was talking to his skill. The master said that a skill is summoned by the master's will, not by speech. Daniel said that his skill is summoned by an invitation. 1 second. 2. 3. And then the air to Daniel's right rippled. The skill appeared. Not quickly, slowly, as if reluctantly, lazily. Like a teenager who left the room because he was called, not because he wanted to. 2 meters tall, gray, with a sword on his back. Eyes like flames slowly scanned the square, the crowd, the commission, with an expression that could be described as boredom. The square fell silent. Inquisitor Lowe sat up straight in his chair. His eyes narrowed. He sensed energy, and it wasn't D-rank energy. The 4 masters exchanged glances. One pulled out a measuring crystal. He held it up to the skill. The crystal glowed so brightly that the master jerked his hand away. Rank A, at least. The senior master slowly stood up. He asked how a D-rank skill had reached rank A in 6 years. Daniel told the truth. The skill had grown on its own, without his involvement, because Daniel had given it the freedom to grow. The master frowned and asked what that meant. Daniel explained, briefly and clearly, like a product pitch. His skill doesn't obey commands. It cooperates by mutual agreement. It decides for itself when to come and when to go. It chooses for itself how to complete a task, and that is precisely why it rose to rank A in 4 months of independent existence, because a free skill grows 10 times faster than a subordinate one. The hall buzzed. The commission began to talk among themselves. Inquisitor Law raised his hand. Silence. He stood up. He walked to the edge of the platform. He looked at the skill, then at Daniel. His voice was calm and steady. He said that a free skill was a contradiction in terms. that a skill, by definition, was bound to its master, that the freedom of a skill was excommunication, and excommunication was a curse. He asked if Daniel was excommunicated. The square froze. The word had been spoken. Excommunication. Everyone knew what that meant. The stake. Daniel stood on the platform. The skill stood beside him. Behind him in the crowd, Hae-in held Min-ho close. So-ra stood among the onlookers with a stony expression. Daniel looked the Inquisitor in the eye, and he said no. He was not excommunicated. Excommunication is when the skill leaves and does not return. His skill had left and returned, of its own free will. This was not excommunication. This was a partnership. He said he was proposing a new term, host partner, one whose skill acts of its own free will rather than by command. Lo was silent. He watched. Then he said he wanted to see the second stage, the combat trial, right now. Daniel nodded. He was ready. The combat test took place in an arena behind the guild building, a circular platform 20 meters in diameter, a stone floor, grandstands all around. For ordinary candidates, the opponent was a training golem, a clay doll brought to life by a guild master. The golem's rank was matched to the candidate's rank. For Daniel, Lo chose differently. He pitted a living fighter against him, a B-rank guild knight, a bearer of the Iron Fist skill, a grown man, 30 years old, experienced, muscles like ropes. His skill encased his fists in gray metal armor. A punch from such a fist could break through a stone wall. Lo said that since Daniel's skill was rank A, his opponent had to be a serious one. Daniel understood. This wasn't a test, it was a provocation. Lo wanted to see how an unbound skill behaved in combat. Would he lose control? Would he kill? Would he show signs of excommunication? Daniel stepped into the arena. The knight stood opposite him, cracking his neck. He looked at Daniel as if he were nothing more than an annoying formality. A skinny, muscleless guy against a guild knight. The outcome was obvious. If it weren't for the 2-meter-tall gray silhouette that appeared behind Daniel's shoulder. The skill stood beside him, sword in hand, eyes like flames focused on the opponent. But he didn't attack. He waited. Daniel turned to him. He spoke quietly. But the acoustics in the arena were good, and the stands heard every word. He said, "The task, defeat your opponent. The conditions, do not maim, do not kill, minimal damage. How you carry it out is up to you. If you see a better option than a direct attack, use it. Deadline, 3 minutes." The skill tilted his head. He looked at the knight, then back at Daniel, and made a gesture with his hand, one finger raised. 1 minute. Daniel suppressed a smile. Skill was haggling over the deadline, like a developer who says a 3-day task can be done in 1. Daniel nodded. 1 minute. The knight took a fighting stance. His iron fists glowed, heavy, powerful. He was ready for a long battle against a serious opponent. Skill moved, not forward, to the side, quickly. The knight spun around. He struck. His fist cut through the air. Skill was already behind him. He didn't attack. He moved. He circled. The knight struck again and again. Every blow hit empty air. The skill dodged effortlessly, like an adult playing tag with a child. The stands roared. The knight was furious. His strikes grew wider, more careless. He was wasting his energy. The skill hadn't landed a single blow. He was simply moving, dodging, circling, and the knight was getting tired. After 40 seconds, the knight was breathing heavily. His iron fists were losing their luster. The energy of the iron fist skill was being expended with every strike, and not a single strike had hit its mark. The skill stopped. He stood before the knight. He raised his sword. The knight raised his fists. And then the skill struck, once, with the flat side of the sword, against the knight's hands. The blow was both precise and gentle. The iron armor on the fists cracked and crumbled. The knight stood with bare hands. His skill had shut down, overload from wasted energy. Daniel's skill lowered his sword. He took a step back. He looked at Daniel. 53 seconds, less than a minute, just as promised. The arena was silent. Then someone clapped, a single clap, then another and another. Not an ovation, confused applause from people who didn't understand what they'd just seen. The knight stood in the arena and looked at his hands. He wasn't injured, not a scratch, not a bruise, but his skill had been deactivated with a single blow, not by brute force, by strategy. Daniel's skill had worn down his opponent and then deactivated his skill with a single precise strike. No blood, no pain. Lo sat in the stands, silent. His face was impassive, but his eyes were different. Not bored, not contemptuous, alert. He had seen it. The skill had acted on its own. It had chosen the tactics itself. It had executed them itself. Daniel hadn't given any commands during the fight, only the initial parameters. The skill decided everything else on its own. This was impossible according to all the guild's manuals. A skill cannot make tactical decisions. A skill carries out its master's will. A skill is a hand, not a brain. But this skill was thinking, planning, executing. And after the victory, it turned to its master, not for approval, but to show the result, like a specialist handing in a project. Stage 3. The interview. The committee and Daniel, one-on-one, in a room behind the guild building. 4 masters and Lo. Daniel sat down in front of them. Lo asked the questions, calmly, methodically. When skill left, why, how he returned, what partnership means, how Daniel sets goals, why skill obeys. Daniel answered. He didn't lie, he didn't exaggerate, he told it like it was. Skill left because the old Dan was a bad master. He came back because the new Dan offered a different kind of relationship. Partnership means that skill has a say. Tasks are set based on parameters, not emotions. Skill obeys because he wants to, not because he has to. Lo listened. Then he asked the most important question. He asked what would happen if skill decided not to obey, if he refused a task, if he walked away at a critical moment.
If, in battle, he chose his own course of action rather than his master's. Daniel answered. He said that this had happened, and it would happen again, because skill is a person, not a program. But that's where its strength lies, because a skill that thinks for itself sees what the owner doesn't see. A skill that makes decisions in battle faster than the owner can issue a command. A skill that's motivated from within, not from without, works 10 times more effectively. He said there was a risk, but the result was worth the risk. Lo was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. He said the commission would reach a decision by evening. Daniel left. Hae-in was waiting in the square. Min-ho was eating a pastry he'd bought from a vendor. Amber was standing by the wall. She had come. Daniel didn't know she'd be here. She nodded at him, briefly, in a military manner. A shadow stood beside her, the double shadow. Not as dim as it had been a month ago, brighter, not fully restored, but alive, standing beside its mistress. Daniel nodded in response. That evening, the town crier stepped out into the square. He read aloud the commission's decisions. 22 candidates had been awarded ranks. Most were C and D. 2 were B. 1 rejection. Daniel's name was last. The town crier read it out. Seo Dan, the village of So-ra. Skill, Nameless Apprentice. Commission's decision, accepted. Rank, special. Category, host partner. The first in the guild's history. The square buzzed. People exchanged glances. A new category. No one had ever heard of such a thing. Daniel stood and listened. Then he looked at Hae-in. She stood with her back straight. Her eyes sparkled. Min-ho tugged at her arm and asked what special rank meant. She didn't answer. She just stood there and looked at her brother. So-ra stood among the onlookers. Her face was impassive, but the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. Lo stood on the platform and looked at Daniel for a long time. Then he turned and walked away. Daniel knew this wasn't the end. Lo would report to Hale. Hale would arrive, and then the real test would begin. But today they had won. The 2 months after the certification passed quickly. Life had changed. Daniel received his guild token and a small stipend. Not much, but it was steady. The farm was no longer their only source of income. Hae-in was finally able to rest. Not entirely. She didn't know how to relax, but at least she'd stopped getting up before dawn every day. The little skill that the Nameless Apprentice had brought from the forest had taken root in the house. Hae-in named it Ogonyo because it glowed blue when it slept. It was quiet and timid and hid under the stove when strangers came. But in the evenings, it would come out and sit next to Min-ho. The boy would hold out his hand, and Ogonyok would rub its head against it. Daniel watched. Min-ho was 10. In 3 years, his own skill would awaken, but the little homeless skill had already chosen him, not as a master, but as a friend. Amber returned a week after the certification. She said that the double shadow was recovering, slowly. They were learning anew, not as mistress and tool, as partners. Amber said it was harder than any contract, that talking to a skill was scarier than fighting the Nameless. Daniel said that was how it was supposed to be. She snorted and stayed to help out on the farm, because she had nowhere else to go, and because her skill felt better when she was near Daniel. So-ra twice a month. Officially, to monitor the first partner bearer. Unofficially, because she didn't have to pretend around Daniel. The scales of truth began speaking to her more often, not with words, with images, with sensations. So-ra was learning to listen. Once she said that the scales had shown her something strange, an image, a huge figure. Not gray like Daniel's skill, white, like pure light, and cracks were radiating from it, thousands of cracks. Each crack became a tiny creature, a skill. So-ra said she didn't understand what it meant. Daniel understood, or began to understand. The Nameless One, the being that had split itself apart 1,000 years ago, the fragments that became skills. He didn't say anything to So-ra. It wasn't time yet. 3 months after the certification, a girl arrived in the village, young, disheveled, with a lute on her back, dirty traveling clothes, bare feet. She stood at the gate and looked at Daniel with huge eyes. She introduced herself, Lea Winter, the daughter of Baron Winter from the eastern province. She had run away from home. Her skill, glass voice, created illusions through music. Beautiful, useless. That's what her father thought. The Baron wanted a warrior son, but got a musician daughter. For 20 years, he had told her that her skill was a mistake of nature, that she was flawed. Lea heard about a partner bearer from So-ra, about a man who talks to skills as if they were people, and she came. 3 weeks on foot, barefoot for the last 2 days because her boots had fallen apart. Daniel looked at her. He looked at the lute. He asked her to play. Lea sat down on the bench. She touched the strings. The sound was pure and sad, and images began to float around her, transparent, shimmering, a forest of colored glass, a river of liquid silver, birds with wings of morning light. The glass voice created illusions of incredible beauty, not a weapon, not a shield, beauty. Daniel watched. Hae-in stood in the doorway with her mouth agape. Min-ho laughed and reached out toward the glass birds. Even Daniel's skill appeared on the barn roof and watched. When the music faded and the illusions melted away, Daniel told Lea one thing. He said that this wasn't a weapon. It's a language. It speaks to the world rather than fighting it, and that he needs exactly this kind of language. Because in 2 weeks, Daniel's team is leaving on their first mission to the Rift. And to distract the Nameless Ones, Lea's illusions are worth more than 10 swords. Lea blinked. Then she burst into tears, quietly, not out of grief, but because for the first time in her life, someone had said that her skill was needed, not in spite of the fact that she had it, but precisely because of what it was. A week later, Riley O'Brien arrived, 17 years old, red hair, freckled, smeared with motor oil, with a bag full of tools and blueprints. She wasn't a carrier. Her skill hadn't manifested. A rarity. 1 in 1,000. She'd come from the Artisans Guild. She'd heard about the host partner and wanted to understand the mechanics of the connection between the host and the skill. Not the magical kind, the physical kind, the measurable kind. Daniel looked at her blueprints. He saw diagrams of resonators and communication amplifiers, rough but brilliant. He asked if she had designed a device that amplifies the channel between the host and the skill. Riley nodded. She said that if a skill is energy, then that energy can be measured, and what can be measured can be amplified. Daniel smiled. The first engineer on his team. He appointed her head of technical support. Riley beamed as if she'd been awarded a medal. The team assembled. Daniel, the skill, Hae-in with silent stitch in case of injuries, Amber with her regenerating double shadow, Lea with glass voice for illusions, Riley with tools and blueprints, So-ra as an observer. 6 people, 4 with skills, 1 engineer without a skill, and 1 coordinator who couldn't fight but could see the big picture. A raid on the rift, a crack in the ground 2 days' journey from Seoul. The Nameless were emerging from there, small ones, but their numbers were growing. The surrounding villages had asked the guild for help. The guild promised to send a detachment in a month. Daniel decided not to wait. The rift was worse than they'd described. A crack in the ground 10 meters wide and as long as the eye could see. Cold, and the stench of rot emanated from it. The edges were melted, black. The land around it was dead. No grass, no trees, only gray ash. A fog rose from the fissure, thick, dark, and figures moved within the fog. Nameless, dozens, maybe hundreds, small and medium-sized, eyeless, with long limbs. They crawled out of the fissure like ants from a ravaged anthill. The team stood on a hill 300 meters away. Daniel looked through the spyglass Riley had assembled from lenses and copper tubes. He counted. About 40 nameless ones outside. It was still unknown how many were inside the fissure. Against them were 6 people and 4 skills, one of which hadn't fully recovered yet. A standard guild squad for clearing out such a rift consisted of at least 20 B-rank fighters. Daniel had 1 A-rank skill, 1 mercenary with a semi-functional B-rank skill, 1 musician with a non-commercial skill, 1 herbalist with a skill that patches things up but doesn't heal, 1 engineer with no skill at all, and himself. A coordinator with no combat skills. Daniel smiled. At work, this was called limited resources, and it was precisely with limited resources that the best solutions emerged. He unfolded the map they had drawn up the day before. He arranged the pebbles marking their positions, and he began assigning tasks. Lea, position on the western slope. The glass voice creates the illusion of a large detachment, 50 warriors, with torches, with sound, as realistic as possible. The goal is to divert the bulk of the nameless ones to the west. The nameless ones reacted to movement and sound. Lee's illusion could force them to move away from the fissure for 10 to 15 minutes. Amber, position on the eastern flank. Double shadow covers the right flank. Task, prevent any lone nameless ones who aren't fooled by the illusion from getting through. Minimal contact. Isolate. Don't kill. Conserve skill energy. Ha-in. Rear position. Silent seam on standby. If anyone gets hurt, she's first. Min-ho was left in the village with Old Moon. Riley. Position next to Daniel. Her device. The resonator. A rough prototype. A copper frame with a crystal inside. According to calculations, it amplified the channel between the host and the skill by 10 to 15% within a 20-meter radius. Not battle-tested, but Riley hadn't slept for 3 nights to finish it in time for the mission. Daniel's ability, the main striking force. The objective, enter the fissure, seal the source. According to the guild, there is a core inside every rift, a black stone the size of a head that generates the nameless. Destroying the core means sealing the rift. The skill listened to the mission. He looked at the rift, then at Daniel, and made a gesture that Daniel had learned to understand over the past 4 months. He raised 2 fingers, 2 questions. Daniel nodded. Skill pointed at the crack, then at himself. Then he spread his arms. 1 question. How deep is it? Daniel said he didn't know. The data is contradictory. Maybe 20 meters, maybe 100. Skill nodded. He made a second gesture. He pointed at Daniel, then at the crack. Then he shook his head. Second question. You're not going inside. Daniel hesitated. He said no. He'd stay up top. Coordinate. Skill nodded, approvingly. He didn't want Daniel to go into the crack. Not because Daniel would get in the way, because he was worried. Daniel saw this and felt warmth in the empty slot, not from the core. Real. The operation began at dawn. Lea began to play. The glass voice roared to its full power. A detachment appeared on the western slope, 50 warriors made of colored glass, with swords, with torches.
the sound of footsteps, the clang of metal, shouts of commands. The illusion was flawless. The Nameless turned. A mass of dark figures moved westward. 30 out of 40 fell for it. 10 remained. Amber moved in from the eastern flank. The double shadow was dimmer than before, but it worked. Amber and her shadow moved in sync. 2 short swords, 4 blades. They cut off the lone Nameless ones who hadn't followed the illusion. They didn't kill, they cut them off. They pushed them back. They held the perimeter. Daniel's skill slipped into the crack, disappeared into the fog. Daniel stood at the edge and felt it through the connection. Far away, deep inside. Movement. Strikes. The skill was cutting through the Nameless ones inside the crack, one by one, quickly, efficiently, without wasted movements. Riley activated the resonator. The copper frame hummed. The crystal glowed. Daniel felt the connection with the skill grow clearer, as if a radio had tuned in to the right frequency. He sensed the skill more clearly. He saw what the skill saw: darkness, walls of black stone, figures of the Nameless in the passageways, and ahead, far below, a pulsating light, the core. The skill reached the core in 12 minutes. Daniel was counting. 12 minutes and roughly 30 Nameless ones along the way. Skill stood before the core, a black stone the size of a head. It pulsed with a dark light. Threads emanated from it, thin, black. They stretched toward the walls and ceiling and disappeared into the ground. Each thread gave birth to a new, Nameless one. Skill raised his sword and paused. Daniel sensed it through the bond. Doubt. Skill looked at the core and felt something familiar, as if the core were like himself, small, lost, doing what it knew how to do. The Nameless ones weren't evil. They were a function of the core, just as Skill was a function of his master. The core was doing what it was created to do. It was giving birth, without a purpose, without meaning, simply because that's how it worked. Skill slowly lowered his sword. He looked at the core. He reached out his hand and touched it. Daniel felt a flash. Not pain, information. A stream of images. He saw it. A white figure, huge, standing in the void, looking at the world it had created, and slowly, of its own volition, dividing itself into thousands of shards. Each shard becomes a skill. Each receives a name. Each sets out to find a person, to discover, to understand, to learn what it means to be close to someone. And those shards that didn't find a person, that remained alone, that were not chosen or were lost, they fell down into the cracks and became the cores of the schisms. The Nameless were not enemies. They were the cry of lonely shards that found no one. The skill withdrew its hand from the core. It turned and stepped out of the crack, without a blow, without destruction. The core continued to pulsate, but the Nameless ones stopped crawling out, as if the core had sensed the touch of a kindred shard and calmed down. For a minute, maybe an hour, maybe a day, temporarily. But it was enough for the surrounding villages to breathe a sigh of relief. Skill emerged from the fissure, covered in black dust. The sword was clean, not a drop of dark blood. He hadn't killed the core, he'd spoken to it. Daniel stood at the edge and watched him, and for the first time ever, he felt that he understood the scale of what he was facing. This isn't about ranks. It's not about the guild. It's not about the certification. It's about 1,000 years of loneliness, thousands of shards of a single being, scattered across the world, searching for someone. And those who didn't find anyone became schisms. He looked at the team. Lea was sitting on the slope with her lute. The illusion had faded. She was smiling. The first battle. The first victory. Her skill wasn't a mistake of nature. It had saved dozens of lives today. Amber was wiping down the swords. Double Shadow stood nearby, brighter than in the morning, fighting together. Not on orders, together. Shadow recovered faster when she acted of her own free will. Hae-in was bandaging a scratch on Amber's arm. The quiet stitch glowed softly. It didn't heal, it patched, but it patched it with a warmth that Amber could feel, and from which she turned away so no one would see her face. Riley hugged the resonator and muttered that she needed to rework the coil and add a second crystal, and that next time it would be better. So-ra stood off to the side and silently stared at the crack. The scales of truth within her were silent, but they were silent in a different way, not like before. Before, it was the silence of a wall. Now, it was the silence of a person who thinks before speaking. Marcus Hale arrived a week after the raid, not alone, with a detachment of 12 Inquisitors, on horseback, in full battle gear, red cloaks, swords drawn. Daniel saw them from the hill. He counted 12, plus Hale himself, 13, against 6. Hae-in turned pale. Amber placed her hands on her swords. Lea pressed her lute to her chest. Riley hid behind Amber. So-ra stood motionless. Her face was stony. She knew Hale was coming. She'd reported it to him herself. About everything. About Daniel. About the partnership. About the raid. About how the skill had touched the core of the schism and silenced it. She'd reported it because it was her job, and because she believed Hale needed to see it for himself. Hale halted the squad in the center of the village. He dismounted. He was tall, taller than Daniel remembered from descriptions. 28 years old, blonde hair, light eyes, a clean-shaven face. No malice, no contempt. Calm, absolute calm. The calm of a man who knows for certain that the world is black and white, and that he stands on the side of white. His skill, righteous judgment. Daniel could sense it even from a distance. Powerful, steady, burning with an even flame, a skill that fed on its master's confidence. The more firmly Hale believed in his own righteousness, the stronger his skill became. It was impossible to defeat him by force. Daniel stepped forward to meet him, alone, unarmed. The skill didn't appear. Daniel hadn't summoned it. This was supposed to be a conversation, not a fight. Hale looked at him for a long time, appraisingly. Then he spoke. His voice was steady, emotionless. He said he'd received reports from Lo, from So-ra, from the scouts, about what he knew regarding the skill acting on its own, about the partnership, about the raid on the schism, and about how the skill had touched the core instead of destroying it. He said that all of this had one name, Excommunication, that a free skill is a skill that has spiraled out of control, that partnership is a euphemism for a loss of power, that a skill that makes its own decisions is a bomb that will explode sooner or later, and that Daniel So is to be burned according to the guild's excommunication protocol. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When Hale finished, Daniel asked one thing. He asked if Hale knew what had really happened to his family. Hale froze. His expression didn't change, but his eyes, something flickered in them. He said that an exiled carrier had killed his family when Hale was 8, that he'd seen it himself, a creature without a master, a being that had lost its mind and killed everything in its path. Daniel shook his head. He told him what he'd learned from Yuna, the wanderer who'd come to him 2 weeks ago. Yuna, an excommunicated bearer, a survivor, 8 years alone. She knew the truth because she had been there that night. 20 years ago, the excommunication took place in the Haelu village. A local farmer, his skill had vanished. The guild found out. They sent a squad, not inquisitors, cleaners, those who cover up the traces. They killed the farmer, they killed his family, and they killed the Hale family. Not because the Hales were guilty, because they had seen it, because witnesses to the excommunication were never spared. Little Marcus survived by chance. He hid in the basement, and the guild blamed it all on the skill that had fled. It created the perfect enemy, and it created the perfect avenger. Hale stood motionless. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. His skill was inside him. Daniel could feel it. Righteous judgment pulsed. It flickered. The host wavered, and the skill lost its stability, because righteous judgment fed on confidence. And that confidence was cracking. Hale said it was a lie. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. Daniel said that trainee Inquisitor So-ra was standing nearby, the bearer of the scales of truth. A skill that senses lies. Let her check. So-ra stepped forward. She stood between them. She looked at Hale, then at Daniel. She placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder. Her skill was working. 1 second. 2. She removed her hand. She turned to Hale and said one word: truth. Hale stood there. Silence. The village was silent. His inquisitors stood behind him, waiting for an order. Hale gave no order. He stood there, looking at Daniel, and something inside him was breaking. 20 years of hatred built on lies. 20 years of righteous anger directed at the wrong people. 20 years of certainty that had fueled his skill and made him strong. And all that certainty crumbled like a wall of sand. His skill faded. The righteous judgment quietly went out like a candle in the wind. Hale staggered. He grabbed the bow lying next to the saddle. He steadied himself, but his face turned gray, empty, like that of a man who had lost everything he believed in and hadn't yet found anything to replace it with. Daniel looked at him. He could have finished him off. He could have said that the guild had used him, that he had been their tool, their skill, directed at the targets they had chosen. But he didn't say it, because Hale wasn't a villain. He was a client with a flawed brief, a man who, 20 years ago, had been given the wrong mission and had carried it out flawlessly for 20 years. Daniel did what he always did. He walked over, sat right on the ground in front of Hale, took out a notebook, and said that if Hale was ready to listen, Daniel would tell him everything, from the very beginning, slowly, because he needed to take notes. Hale looked down at him for a minute. Then he slowly lowered himself to the ground. He sat down across from him. His interrogators exchanged glances. The senior one took a step forward. Hale raised his hand, a stop sign, the same gesture Daniel had used when he stopped his skill. Stop, wait, listen. Daniel began to speak about the skills, about the shards, about the nameless one who split himself 1,000 years ago, about how skills aren't tools but personalities, that excommunication isn't a curse but an awakening, that the nameless creatures from the schisms are the cry of lonely shards, that the entire guild system is built on the suppression of what should be a partnership. Hale listened, silently. His face was impassive, but his eyes were alive, listening, absorbing. With Ra stood beside him and said nothing. The scales of truth were silent too, not because they didn't feel anything, because it was all true. Daniel spoke for an hour. Hale listened for an hour. He didn't interrupt once. When Daniel finished, silence fell, long, heavy. Hale looked at his hands. Then he spoke softly. He said that inside he felt empty, that the righteous judgment was silent, that he couldn't feel it, for the first time in 20 years. Daniel nodded. He said he understood, that his own skill had also fallen silent when the old Dan had stopped noticing it. 4 years of silence. He asked Hale if he'd ever tried to listen to his skill, not to command it, not to direct it, just to listen. Hale said no. Why listen to a weapon? Daniel said that righteous judgment wasn't a weapon. It was a part of Hale that had been screaming the same thing for 20 years. Truth, justice, and for 20 years had been directing that cry in the wrong direction. Maybe the skill was tired. Maybe it was hurting too. Maybe it too needed someone to ask how it was doing. Hale sat on the ground in the middle of the village. Inquisitor, righteous one, the terror of the excommunicated. He sat in the dust, staring at the ground, and Daniel saw something change in his face. Not right away, slowly, like dawn. Hale closed his eyes. He placed a hand on his chest, and for the first time in 20 years, he didn't give an order. He didn't direct. He asked, inside, quietly, "You're here." A second, 2, 10, and from the depths of his chest came an answer. Not a word, not an image. Warmth, small, faint, like a candle's flame after 20 years of darkness. The righteous judgment hadn't gone away. It had been waiting. It had waited 20 years for its master to finally stop shouting and start listening. Hale opened his eyes. They were wet. He stood up. He looked at Daniel. He said he needed time. Daniel said there was time. Hale nodded. He turned to his inquisitors. He ordered them to return to Kaen-ni. No arrests, no burnings. The senior inquisitor opened his mouth to object. Hale looked at him with a single glance. The senior inquisitor shut his mouth. They left.
Daniel sat on the ground and watched as the red cloaks disappeared around the bend. Skill appeared beside him, quietly. He sat down next to Daniel, right on the ground. 2 meters of gray light crossed his legs and rested his sword on his knees. Just like back then in the courtyard at So-ra's. They sat side by side, the master and Skill, partners. Hae-in approached. She stood behind him. She placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder, gently, just as he had placed his hand on her head back then. Amber stood by the fence. Double Shadow was beside her, brighter than ever, almost fully restored. Lea sat on a bench, quietly plucking the strings. The glass voice created little sparks of light around her. Not an illusion, just light, just beauty. Riley was repairing the resonator and muttering about a second version with a double crystal. So-ra stood off to the side, her hand on her chest, her eyes closed. She was listening. The scales of truth were speaking to her, quietly, through images. For the first time in 6 years, truly. Daniel took out a notebook. He opened a blank page. He wrote the title, A Guide to Restoring the Connection Between the Host and the Skill. Version 1. Author, Seo Dan, So-ra Village. He began to write. The Skill sat nearby and watched. He tilted his head, peered at the notes, like a junior peering over a team leader's shoulder, trying to figure out what he was writing. Daniel showed him the page. Skill looked at it. Then he raised his hand. He pointed his finger at the line that read, Skill carries out the task according to the host's parameters. He shook his head. Then he pointed his chest and tapped Daniel and raised both fingers together, just like back then. You, me, together. Daniel crossed out the line, wrote a new one. Skill and host define the task together. Skill nodded, approvingly. The first draft passed the initial code review. Daniel kept writing. Skill sat beside him. 2 suns were setting behind the hills, one after the other. Orange, purple, silence. And somewhere far away, in the cracks across the continent, deep within the rifts, small, lonely shards froze. For a second, for a moment, as if they sensed that someone had finally begun searching for the answer. Not with a sword, not with fire, with a notebook and patience. Daniel closed his notebook. He looked at Navik, said that was enough for today. They'd continue tomorrow. Navik stood up, stretched. The 2-meter-tall gray figure stretched like a human after sitting for a long time. He looked down at Daniel, and for the first time ever, he made a sound. Not a grumble, not a snort, a sound like quiet laughter. Short, hoarse, almost human. Then he turned and walked toward the shed. He didn't just fade away. He walked, step by step, like a man walking home after a day's work. Daniel watched him go. Then he turned to Hae-in. She was standing nearby. Her eyes were dry. Her back was straight. She was wearing new boots. She said there would be porridge with meat tomorrow, and that Daniel needed to eat more protein, and that the shutters were creaking again, and that Min-ho wanted his brother to show him the sword stance. Daniel nodded. He stood up. He brushed off his pants. He went into the house. At dinner, at the usual evening meal in an ordinary village house, where ordinary people lived with extraordinary friends who glowed in the dark and brought dead monsters to the porch. The lights were on at the So family's farm. The smell of porridge and roasted meat wafted from the kitchen. Min-ho sat by the stove, petting fire. The little blue Skill purred. Lea played a something quiet on the lute. Amber was sharpening swords. Riley was drawing a blueprint for the 3rd version of the resonator. On the barn roof, a 2-meter-tall Skill sat as a dark silhouette against the violet sky. He was looking at the stars, not at anyone, just at the stars, because he could, because he was free, and because tomorrow morning he'll be back. Not because he was ordered to, not because of a contract, because he'll want to. Daniel sat down at the table. He opened his notebook. He wrote down the last line of the day. Day 123. Skill is in place. The team is in place. Hale was gone. The rift had subsided. The training manual had begun. We'll continue tomorrow. He closed the notebook, picked up a spoon, and began to eat.